Thank you everyone for being here this morning online on a lovely sunny Wednesday morning. So I just want to briefly welcome you all and introduce the event. We've got a really exciting and energising few sessions in terms of getting our heads around how people are teaching sociology within universities across the UK. And I just want to begin by sort of explaining where the idea for this event came from, really. It's teaching sociology and thinking and rethinking how we teach sociology and perhaps how we can teach it slightly different to best capture our students is something that I've had an interest in from the very first moment that I stepped inside a seminar, a lecture as a PhD student and engaged with the students that I was teaching. And this is a conversation that struck me as something that we don't tend to have within the discipline of British sociology, which is in contrast to the conversations that have been happening in the US. They've got a journal, Teaching Sociology, where individuals regularly share their practices, their pedagogies, and problematizes the way in which sociology is taught within universities. So I discussed the idea of doing something around pedagogy with Rachel, and we were totally kind of taken aback by the amount of interest that we received. So we intended to just have a very short, perhaps hour and a half, 2 hour online session where individuals kind of shared their practices, but actually what happened was that about 43 papers were submitted, and we were spoilt for choice, quite literally. And we had to turn a lot of high quality, really interesting, innovative abstracts away. So if there is anyone today that sat in this session who had submitted, it's by no means a reflection of the quality of your work. So today what we've got is a few panels, a few sessions, and then at the end a panel where individuals will be sharing their various teaching practices and pedagogies. And what I hope that we take away from today is a space to kind of exchange ideas, debate ideas, but hopefully not just a space that confines it to today, but a conversation that, you know, we continue to have over the course of the discipline. So that's enough from me. In our first panel, I think it's okay for us to start 5 minutes early. It just means that we can have an extra 5 minutes for the break or so, which I'm sure we'll all welcome. So in our first panel, we've got Dr. Emma Jackson and Dr. Peter Manning. So what I will do, just to let the speakers know, is I will introduce you, I'll hand it over to you, and then what I will do is I'll give you a 5 minute a 5 minute warning, and then I will come in and tell you when the presentation has finished. And then what we will do, we'll have Emma first, then Peter, and then we will have a combined Q&A. So if I could just ask everyone that's not talking when the presentations are going on to kindly mute their microphones, that would be great. And you are welcome to either enter your questions into the chat, or you can wait and raise your hand and verbally put those questions through, whatever you feel comfortable with. And just another note, just to make everyone aware, this session is being recorded and it will go on the British Sociological Association's website. So just to kind of bear that in mind as well. Okay, Emma, I'll hand it over to you. So Dr. Emma Jackson is at Goldsmiths University, and her presentation is entitled Walking Sociologically, Teaching on the Move.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for being here. Today I'm joining you from sunny Catford in my shed in southeast London. Thanks for having me at this important event. I'm going to use my slot to talk about walking in teaching sociology. While there's been discussion and writing about using walking as a social research method, I haven't been able to find much about using walking in teaching, particularly in sociology, though I would love recommendations if you have them. And I'm going to be talking here specifically about one course that I teach, but I should say I use walking throughout my research in teaching. It's one area of my work where my teaching has informed my research as much as my research informs my teaching. I should say at the outset where I'm speaking from, Goldsmiths is famous for its inventive forms of teaching and doing sociology. But I have to note both the personal discombobulation of teaching this course this term while learning that my entire department has been put in a redundancy pool. And for me, I think this is there's a threat here to creative forms of teaching sociology. And we're not the only one. So I think we need to think about the contexts in which we teach, and also to ask you to please consider supporting us in any way that you can. It's within these circumstances this term that I've been teaching the course London. It's a course that I originally inherited from Caroline Knowles, a great writer of walking in the city, and I've modified it over time. I've been teaching it since 2016 with a break for COVID. It's taught across 5 weeks, and it's taught in intensive 4-hour sessions. That doesn't mean we're walking for the whole 4 hours, as I hope will become clear. And what I've found is that teaching in this way really shakes up the classroom dynamic. So it's a second-year undergraduate option course. So the first thing to say about it is that the walking that we do in this class is collective. So we're not, we're not pursuing this kind of lone figure walking around the city that still haunts a lot of writing on the urban. We move through the streets together and we discuss what we see, hear, and feel. I'll always set out a theme and 2 readings. I have places where I know I will stop to discuss certain points, but this isn't a blue badge tour, which I always, really stress for the students. And these are sociological walks. Plus, the city is always changing. So you think something's going to go one way, and then you get there and something else has happened, a place is closed. So this year I was teaching in Peckham. I was going to take the students to a rooftop bar with a viewing platform. And then when we got there, the bar had closed down. But what was great was that one of the students had experience in working for the organisation that operated the rooftop bar, and told us all about the clientele, what it was like to work in these spaces, and really brought her experience into the walk, which was great. So moving through the streets together allows us to become attuned to how different forms of power unfold in and through public space, and to read spaces and the futures of spaces against the grain. So we talk a lot as we move about how is history represented in this space, what's missing from what you know of this space, what are your experiences of this space. It's important to honour my influences and inspirations in forging this approach to walking, and I'll just set out a few. Firstly, Morag Rose and the Loiterers Resistance Movement in Manchester, and I take a couple of things from Morag. Firstly is an inclusive approach to walking. So walking isn't just about, speeding around the city. It can involve using sticks, it can involve using wheels. And secondly, I get from the LRM this power of walking together and in conversation. And actually, maybe there's a third thing. The third thing is that walking does something. So the LRM focus a lot on gentrification in the city and resisting those processes. And in walking together, you also do something in that space, which is also links to another inspiration, the Blank Noise Collective, who are a feminist collective from Bangalore in India, who use walking to stage interventions in public. And I love their step-by-step guide to unapologetic walking here. So I think this also encourages to think about walking in how we might transgress through walking and what our walking does to space. From my colleague, Nirmal Puwar, from her work on space invading and walking, we learn that the way walkers are gendered and racialized or not as we move through the city impacts on our experience, but also that the city is still up for grabs, and such hierarchies have been and continue to be transgressed and challenged. And I love this quotation from Nirmal's piece on the Flanús in Westminster. Boundaries etched in architectures of stone and iron grids do not go unchallenged. Even the coziest and most constrained of public men's dwellings can be shaken. I love that. Women and minoritized people have found ways to inhabit and move around the city. I'm also influenced by Saidiya Hartman's breathtaking book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And she shows how race, class, and gender privileges that underscore accounts of occupying space and walking in the city that have become the canon can be challenged by thinking from the vantage points of the Black women who were most intensely subjected to the gaze and regulation of the early 20th centuries of the American North. So what's really exciting to me about Saidiya Hartman is that the histories of walking are also not fixed. We can reimagine what those might be. So I want to move from talking about the approach to walking that I take to the very practical. How do I do this kind of session? To show you how it works in practice, I want to take you round one of the walks, albeit a whistle-stop version. I've chosen my Westminster walk for two reasons. The first is I feel like Westminster will be the most familiar location to you. Like if I start with one of the other places we walk, I might have to give you loads of context. I'm just going to assume you kind of know what Westminster is. And the second reason is very practical also. It's a shorter walk because this walk encompasses a guided tour of the Houses of Parliament that's given by their in-house guides. So I'm using it to give you a taste of how I run these sessions. So this, the text you can see on the screen is from the blurb for the session. So you get a sense of what the theme is, the writer that we'll be walking with, Nirmal Pua. And these are the ideas that we're taking out for a walk. You can see the mole there. I took that photo around the time of the Queen's funeral. So to sketch out how this works in process. This session, we meet at Charing Cross Station, and the first stopping off point is a statue of the World War II nurse, Edith Cavell. And here at the first stop, I usually introduce the key themes of the walk, so the key ideas here from Nirmal Pua's work. And we also, at this point, talk about the politics of statues. This statue is very unusual in being a named statue of a woman. There are more statues of animals in London than there are named statues of women. So we'll talk about, this will be a longish stop as I'll set out how the session's going to go. And then we walk to Trafalgar Square, which is very close by. And I send the students off for 15 minutes to do the exercise that is on the right of the screen. So straight away there, I'm asking them to think with the space and to come back and talk about it. And it's a place that this year was associated with lots of childhood memories, but also protest. So this gives us a nice way of bringing people in from the beginning of the session. We then cut through down a side street past some homeless tents onto the mall. I've timed this so that we get to see the changing of the guard as it goes down to Buckingham Palace. This was a very happy accident when I was recceing this walk this year, that I realised if I timed it right, we would hit that, which is perfect because one of the themes in the reading is about ritual and performance and how that makes power, reinforces power in place. So we see the changing of the guard. We cut through St James's Park where the students get distracted and take lots of pictures of wildfowl, but you know, that's nice. And then we come through onto the other side to the statue of Clive of India and Churchill's bunker. These things are side by side, which give me the perfect opportunity to bring in Paul Gilroy, another key reading for the session, and his idea of post-colonial melancholia and how that manifests in the built environment. We then cut down a street where there's lots of government ministries. This year I noticed some faded red paint that had been thrown on one of the government ministries. So again, we can talk about these, you know, different layers in the architecture. We take a detour to look at Downing Street. There's usually some form of protest outside Downing Street, or if not, there'll be one as we then turn right and go down towards Parliament Square. So I never know what this is going to be. Sometimes you can guess, but we always see protest. And then we go to Parliament Square and repeat the exercise from Trafalgar Square, have a little break, have a sandwich, and then go to the tour of the Houses of Parliament, which isn't a sociological tour, of course, but it gets us into the chambers. So we went into the House of, we went to view the debate about the post office in the House of Commons. So again, it gives us great insights into ritual performance and the built environment. And then we have a discussion. So in terms of the practicalities of doing this, this this was, do you remember The Beast from the East? I was teaching this course during The Beast from the East, and this is with guest star Les Back. There are some practicalities. The first is the accessibility issues, which always comes up rightly when you're talking about walking. I always ask months ahead if there are mobility issues that I need to think about, but I don't think that completely does away with accessibility issues. I'm sure that when students, this is an option course, and I'm sure students bear that in mind when selecting their options. There is a flip side to the accessibility issues, and that is, I think we shouldn't assume that teaching our familiar lecture seminar format is also without accessibility issues. So I think for students who like to learn in a different way, this can be quite helpful. Dressing for the weather, getting students to dress for the weather is always a challenge. Someone always turns up in really impractical shoes or with no coat, no matter how many times I warn them. The next point is I have to find spaces where we can have seminar discussions, but on the move, where we don't have to buy anything, which is always a challenge in London. It's a very over-commercialized city. If it's nice weather, you're fine. But I'm always looking for these spots where we can stop and talk. The last point is that I do rely on the students being able to get to somewhere that isn't Goldsmiths for 3 out of 5 of these walks. This hasn't been an issue this year, actually. The students have been fine, but after COVID particularly, I found that the students were not confident in negotiating transport and also not very confident about being with each other and talking. So it was a bit challenging to run this course immediately after COVID for those reasons. I'm sure other people will have experiences of that time. I want to end with giving you some words from one of the students from this year. I found the abstract for this conference had been accepted after I finished teaching, but I wrote to the students and someone very kindly sent me something asking them, what do you think about walking as a way of learning? And I thought these words from Luca were amazing, and I'll just read out the middle section of this. Whilst in the classroom, it's easy to learn the themes being discussed in broad terms. Oh, there's a problem. I can't actually see all of the text because of your faces. I don't have to change it. Anyway, on a walk, you will always experience unexpected challenges that necessitate the nuance and reflection that are often lost in the text. Sometimes these will come from your colleagues and peers, sometimes from the space, and sometimes from people you encounter, because people always talk to us. Walking is a grounding experience. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Emma, and perfectly timed. We'll pause questions for the moment and I will introduce Peter and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So Peter, Dr. Peter Manning from the University of Bath will present on exploring questions of responsibility with and for a sociology of human rights. And again, Peter, I will wave my 5 fingers at you when you have 5 minutes left, and I will kindly bring you to an end once the 15 minutes are finished. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit about a unit that runs at Bath in the 2nd year. So it's called Atrocities, Conflict and Human Rights. There's parallels here with some postgraduate teaching I do too. Broadly, this is covering topics that are fairly heavy. So, we start really with questions about theories of rights and then move into debates around understanding atrocity perpetration, atrocity denial, historical injustice like colonialism and slavery, and then sort of key responses to human rights violations like transitional justice and international criminal law. And throughout that, one of the things, because I'm interested in it from my research, will be around how questions of memory after violence sort of attend to these sorts of phenomenon. Now, the unit's been really popular, and I think that's for a set of reasons. I mean, it's partly because our students were lucky; they're very politically committed. They want to think about social problems globally. And unfortunately, the material tends to be quite topical, right? I mean, I'm delivering this stuff. I didn't, this past semester actually, but normally would be delivering this stuff in the context of, news coverage, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan at the moment, Myanmar too. So it's very lively. I'll come back to that in a second. So I just want to talk today about how questions of sort of responsibility work in this unit, because you can't disconnect this from broader claims about sort of blame, guilt, victimhood, And I think really what I want to sort of tease out of this and stress is how that has to link to the kinds of responsibility to care about other people's suffering that really are at the heart of the unit, but at the heart of a sociology of human rights, I think. So I suppose the wider question, I think this is where it might hopefully be relevant for colleagues that aren't teaching in the sociology of human rights. Is how does this sort of question of responsibility figure in our teaching, and what kinds of responsibility connected to that do we want to encourage in our students, right, and ourselves? So I want to preface all of this by just pinning down a few challenges that I've encountered in this work. And the first, I suppose, is a problem that we'll get, across sociological units on, whether it be sort of race and ethnicity or gender, but human rights too. And I'm thinking specifically about the tendency, albeit of a small number of students, to want to see the other side. And this is particularly the case, when we explore questions around historical injustice, coloniality, reparative justice. And always in the unit evaluations, you get a handful of responses that feel that we could have shown sort of another side of an argument, right? That critiques of ongoing advantage arising from colonialism, erase some sort of challenge sort of that a sensibility amongst some students that maybe they feel shouldn't be placed squarely on the table. The second problem is connected to this, and it concerns the sort of topicality, right, of this material and the positioning of the students in the classroom, and beyond what they're bringing from outside of the classroom to it. We teach an incredibly diverse body of students, not just internationally, but in terms of domestic difference too, or UK difference too. And they're going to include members who are affected, whether that be by sort of heritage or geography or whatever, with the material at hand in very different ways. You can imagine sort of even pre-2023 teaching material on, for example, Israel and Palestine through questions of settler coloniality, which we normally would do, would be particularly fraught in the current context. I say normally, it's only because the unit didn't run, or I didn't teach the unit in the first semester this academic year. You want to be able to offer a sense of the condemnation of the atrocities that are happening right now, and solidarity with the people suffering, and solidarity as well with the activist groups and campaigns that are going on across universities worldwide. But to unpack the sort of antecedent histories around these events, to develop histories of the present together, you're doing that whilst wanting to be able to hold and include students in the room who are going to be might be positioned, let's say, very differently around those events. And the third problem I want to pick up on here is just around sort of the nature, I suppose, of critique, right? This is a unit that I deliver that is committed to sort of a critical engagement with human rights, to ask more of human rights. And by this, what I'm getting at is that I worry sometimes that critiques of human rights as imperial or neoliberal, etc., we sometimes risk sort of letting ourselves off the hook a little bit in terms of abstraction and distancing. So when I present sort of human rights as very white, it's very Eurocentric, etc., there's a risk that it feels further away and embedded in structures sort of beyond us than I actually think it is. So I just want to talk very, very briefly about two books that I've read recently that I've been trying to embed, I suppose, in sort of curriculum planning and design around this. I don't actually teach these, but they shape how I teach. And the first is by Michael Rothberg, and this is a book called The Implicated Subject. And this is a book that's all about the sort of social positions and relationships that have a sort of more, I suppose, indirect and historical, sorry, distant or sort of structural and collective relationship to the harms that are at hand. And this is without sort of locating people who are necessarily directly involved in their commissioning or perpetration. So what he's trying to get at is positions which we're going to encounter a lot in the classroom in the UK that are aligned to sort of power and privilege, without sort of any direct legal or individual responsibility for the harms that are on, the content of the sessions that we're doing. So this is in many senses about the sort of social formations that enable the continuation of the harms that we're looking at, enduring legacies of coloniality or sort of long distance bystandership and denial. So that university classroom is part of this. So there's other categories that Rothberg wants to introduce, like beneficiary or perpetrator, that move a bit beyond a sort of more litigious sort of sense of victim and perpetrator, as he describes it, sort of victim and perpetrator imaginary. And this is, I think, particularly helpful for thinking about sort of historical or distant suffering. And I think it's important to caveat this. He doesn't want to do away with the sort of very clear asymmetries of responsibility and harm that are at work here, but he wants to centre that sort of sense of difference around those, while sort of creating space to create acts, I suppose, of responsibility taking instead of individualized conceptions of guilt. The second book is by Alexis Shotwell, so Against Purity, and again this starts with a sort of a relational claim about the sort of ethics and social positioning that we engage in around these sorts of social harms, whether they be sort of human rights or ecological. The book's brilliant, but it's ranging in terms of the topics that it covers, whether it's the erasure of AIDS activism in the 80s or questions of settler coloniality in Canada. But what Shotwell's really asking us to think about is to sort of avoid, I suppose, an impulse towards ethical and political purity. It's seductive and it's very activating, but it tends to be itself sort of a feature of broader sort of racialized and quite colonial structures and quite exclusionary politics and other regimes of domination. So what Shotwell wants us to do is to think about forms of shared future responsibility that are sort of non-identical, but based on thick awareness of historical sort of differences, that we come to the classroom in different ways with different backgrounds, but to sort of create kinds of solidarity and imagining worlds that don't yet exist, right? So very hopeful there. And although that sounds very grand, perhaps, Shotwell gives us this wonderful sort of example of the ways you might pick litter up on the street. It's a mess that you didn't make, but you're doing this practice of responsibility taking, that's sort of repeatedly making yourself accountable for things that you might not necessarily have done. So I think with those two threads, what I'm trying to do is to make visible the sort of varied ways that we might locate responsibility in the context of human rights. It's not just about goodies and baddies, a sort of a softer grounding, I suppose, for thinking about our relationships to those issues, and then to sort of connect that and tether it to a set of ethical questions about contingency and the futures that we might want to imagine in our teaching. Imagining sort of what human rights could do better is, I suppose, the purpose of this. So how does this work in practice? Just briefly, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if how close I am to the deadline.
You've got about 6 minutes.
Brilliant. Sorry. Right. I've got my notes up on a Word document. I was panicking about whether I'd missed the 5-minute warning in the chat. So we know this isn't new. We know from really well established sort of feminist critiques and work in decolonial sort of currents at the moment that curriculum design, unit planning, it itself is political, right? And I think that's not just about, well, of course, it's not just about representation on the reading list, although that matters, but it's about how we think about these sorts of relationships and and questions of responsibility. I think are really central to that, particularly sort of that sort of sense of erasure of non-Western worldviews. So I suppose I'm trying to channel a bit of some C. Wright Mills around how we can talk and think about sort of responsibility and bring questions into dialogue that make these cases that feel sort of quite far away a bit nearer, and then put the taken for granted sort of on the table. So within the sessions, I want to hold these ideas of responsibility close, but I want to put it to work in the classroom. And I think what's key to that is being very explicit with students that you're doing this. That you've got to tell them that responsibility is an object of analysis, because it's at the heart of human rights instruments, human rights legislation, in the cases that we're looking at. But it's also this ethical underpinning for the unit, and showing how those two things are connected. I think is what I want to do, or what I hope to do, is that's encouraging this sort of attentiveness to the complexities of the former, and that hoping that, I suppose, that might feed and nourish the latter. The work in the classroom tends to always rely on small groups or paired discussion around particular human rights reports or media interviews or news commentary, and we want to be able to sort of examine and unpick how human rights approaches tend to work with particular formulations of responsibility within that. And that means thinking about their limits, whether that be sort of civic or legal or therapeutic, but also thinking about the sort of sense of contingency, and building that bridge to the wider challenge of sort of, imagining other ways of doing human rights. So secondly, just in terms of sort of unit design here, one thing I'm quite committed to doing is not exceptionalizing cases as sort of standalone segments. So I think you could do something that's quite global facing, and treat sort of treat each week as, you know, as a particular particular bounded case entity. And I think, you know, that idea of case is quite sort of clumsy. I mean, it's necessary in some ways, but it does a lot of sort of periodization and decontextualization. It sort of leads into sort of, I think, a methodological nationalism that isn't necessarily helpful, I suppose, for this sort of work. So in thinking about cases, you know, as non-interchangeable, but you know, objects that can be put into dialogue in instructive ways, particularly when you're trying to draw out parallels that aren't necessarily obvious. That's at the heart of what I'm trying to do here. So most obviously, I suppose, you know, you could just to give you a few examples from the teaching that I've done recently, you might look at you know, lectures on historical injustice and questions of the failures around reparation in terms of British colonialism, and you can put that into dialogue with post-apartheid South Africa, and you know, through the lens of beneficiaries in particular. Or, you know, when we lecture on questions of nativism and the perpetration of you know, racialized violence and genocide, you might put Cambodia and Rwanda into dialogue with you know, Yarl's Wood, the immigration and detention center. So what I'm trying to do is problematize responsibility, I suppose, in more distributed ways. And I think, you know, in terms of that unit design and the case sort of, you know, selection, it's to create a space that's a little bit less lower pressured, I suppose. You know, and trying to sort of disarm any kind of particularism around this. You know, in all these examples, in all of this work, you know, there's never an exhaustive list of sort of goodies and baddies. You know, and that's kind of what we're trying to avoid a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of very obvious baddies, but complexity is the aim. So I suppose it's you know, about trying to show parallels about, you know, from the past and the present, you know, proximity and distance. And what I'm trying to do is, I hope, craft that sense of sort of attentiveness and shared responsibility and mutual implication that reaches a bit beyond the lecture theatre and into, you know, the world around us a bit more. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Your timing is perfect.
Brilliant.
Perfect, Peter. Thank you very much for that really thought-provoking presentation. We've got some time now for question and answers. I can see that there's a few in the chat. So if anyone would like to continue putting them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, that's not a problem, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I will go through the chat in order of the questions that were posted. Emma, the first question is for you. It's from Julie. Really interesting presentation. How big are your walking groups?
I cap the number at 20, which I know would be very difficult in universities that have much bigger groups of students. But I know Charlotte Bates at Cardiff does a walking course with a lot more students. So she would be a good person to talk to about how to do it with bigger groups. I find that if I'm shepherding 20 students around, that is, I can't speak any louder in the middle of London on a busy street than to more than that number of people. And it's just, it gets a bit unwieldy. If I have walked with bigger groups, but it's a bit tricky. So yeah, I cap it at 20.
Thank you. And the next question is for you, Emma. I'm also interested in the walking classroom and was very intrigued by your paper. I wonder what your assessment for the module is, and whether they also feature the elements of mobility and reflexivity. That would be interesting.
Yeah, it does. The assessment is the students have to write their own walk, so not a walk that we've done in class, a different walk on an urban theme, and they have to also do an observation from a fixed point. And I do encourage the students to try out different forms of writing, and I build that into the week, so we try out different forms of writing as we go. And I encourage, I didn't have time to talk about this, but we use Padlet to share images and pieces of writing if the student wants to. So I want to give them that permission to do something other than a traditional essay. Some students love that, but then it also does come with a certain degree of panic for some students, because by the second year, they've just got their heads around what the standard essay is. And then I say, no, do something different. But I do show them examples, and I do tell them that we'll build up to that through doing class exercises.
Thank you. I've got a question that relates to this point, Emma. In terms of the photos, what guidance do you give them in terms of like the ethics of taking photos publicly, or is it because it's public, it's fine? Or Just wondered.
No, we do talk about that. We talk about the role of photography and sociology right at the beginning. And we also talk about that the ethics of, not taking pictures of people's faces. I mean, I think in public, yeah, it might be, what's legal and what's ethical might be different.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right. Thank you. And I am going through the questions in order. So Pete, that's probably why there's a few for Emma and then there's a few for you after. So we will come back to you. So I'm just reading the question from Vera. Thank you for the interesting talk. I was curious if you've observed how these collective walks have influenced the students' ways of working together as a team and build trust through collaborative efforts. Have you noticed any changings in how they share knowledge, or if it has introduced different forms or ways of knowing?
Good question. I don't know. I see the dynamic in the group changing over time, which is really nice. And I see them staying on to talk to each other or get a cup of tea or spend longer in the place, which I really love. But I don't, apart from working with dissertation students, I don't then teach them in the third year at all, in fact. So I don't see how that carries through for them. What I have really enjoyed is seeing how it carries through into students' dissertations. And I think sometimes it gives permission. I'm thinking of a brilliant dissertation I supervised last year by a young woman who'd grown up in Hackney, who was from a working class background, and did a dissertation on doing walk-in interviews with young people in Hackney. And I think that the course gave her permission both to use walking as a method, but also to think about her own experiences of the city. And that has happened, before.
Okay. Thank you, Emma. I've got a comment from Priscilla. I'm not sure who it's to. It says, how are children 1/3 of the people in the world included or excluded? So I don't know if Priscilla is here and would like to expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for two great talks. What I was wondering was how much children were included in the human rights course, and also how much they were mentioned or not in the marvellous Westminster, the walking courses, or their absence indeed, because you mentioned the absence of women's statues, but children are even more missing, aren't they? But particularly the human rights talk.
Thank you.
Hi, Priscilla. Thanks for the question. I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because I don't include. I mean, I've got colleagues at Bath that work very specifically on questions around sort of child protection and the sort of politics, I suppose, and questions around children's rights, particularly in the Middle Eastern context. I'm talking about Jason Hart specifically, but I've not brought it in as a particular theme on the unit. But it's something I'd like to do, and I'd probably like to introduce a bit further. So maybe I could, or maybe drop me an email, or we could talk about it further. That would be good.
Thank you very much, because I've written a book, Young Children's Rights, arguing that inalienable human rights are innate, and going through the 42 main articles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, arguing that they all start from birth. And I think this hugely strengthens arguments for human rights. And maybe some of you went to the LSE lecture last night of Shami Chakrabarti talking about her new book on children's rights, saying that and agreeing with Conor Geraghty that the key for rights is equal treatment, but also it's about shame, colonialists learning to be ashamed and to recognise equal human rights when we violate them. It was very much about the emotions of human rights as well, not just the cerebral aspects.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. I've got another question for Emma. In what ways can technology be leveraged to make walking sociology more accessible for individuals who may not be able to participate in person? So on the aspect of accessibility.
I think there are, I mean, you could take somebody on a walk. You could use, I was going to say GoPro, but that would probably make everybody feel ill. But you could film it. You could. Michaela's laughing because she's used GoPro in her research. You can. There's ways that you could film it or guide people through maps, so virtual reality. There's all kinds of ways you could use it. I don't know. I do like delivering it in place, I have to say.
Thank you. We've got a question from Chris to Pete. Oh no, title of the books, you've replied to that, sorry. Another question for Pete. How do you embed your approach in your assessment, and can you talk through how your past students have responded to this kind of course? What have some of the practical challenges been?
Thanks, Rachel. So I suppose a few thoughts on this. I mean, the responses overall have been very positive. I mean, it's a popular unit, and I think one of the things that they really like doing, that I sort of explained quite explicitly, is a sort of an alignment of assessment to the sort of activities and practical work that we do in class. Will be around, the use of sort of real world examples, right? I mean, that's not innovative in that sense, but doing sort of collective deconstruction of, for example, human rights reports, right? And if we have that sort of available on the screen, but also sort of on their devices, and you can initiate that around sort of paired or small group works, and then go through it together, and explain that's about sort of building methodological skills. It's key treatment of evidence for the assessments that they might sort of draw on. They always sort of talk about that quite positively in the student evaluations. I think there's always going to be a bit of resistance to the sort of work that I'm doing otherwise, right? And this question of trying to show implication and sort of responsibility for us, right? Within the classroom, and that is always sort of present. I'm not totally sure how to sort of resolve it completely beyond trying to sort of create a space that I suppose doesn't particularly sort of focus on or it's trying to sort of shift, I suppose, to forms of sort of identification that aren't about identity, I suppose. Forms of solidarity that aren't based on identity. So that's really hard. So I don't have a terribly good answer. In terms of just the assessment more broadly, it's really boring as well, right? I tend to sort of be explicit that students that can work across topics and unit themes, being judicious in the way that they do that will get rewarded, right? That's part of the analysis. And if you sort of say that in the instructions, then that, I think that reinforcing that message just really helps. But otherwise, it is just a flat essay, because it's quite a big group. They tend to sort of it's uncapped, so quite often we'll get 80-90 students on the unit. So being able to do different forms of assessment, like presentations and that sort of thing at Bath is a little bit tricky, because the setup sort of militates against very small sort of tutorial or seminar works. We tend to be sort of workshopped at best. I don't want to get too lost on the logistics. Sorry.
Thank you, Pete. Another question to you from Michaela. In respect to communicating to the students the centering of responsibility in the sociology of human rights, what do you tell them about your responsibilities to them as students, but also how do you foster in them what kinds of exercises, what their responsibilities are in the classroom and beyond?
Yeah. So in terms of sort of general sort of orientation of the unit, I try and do the first lecture on the origins of this sort of human rights project, but with a strong emphasis on the idea that the sort of conventional story that starts in 1948, the post-war settlement, is just one way of imagining how this all could have looked, and there's other really important sort of writers and thinkers on, I don't know whether Graham writes in sort of origin stories of like the Haitian Revolution, or sort of transatlantic slavery, or other epistemologies and worldviews in terms of groundings and foundations of rights that you could start from. And that sort of sense of contingency is supposed to sort of underpin just the beginning of a push to sort of imagine other ways of thinking about rights, to ask more of them. In terms of sort of practicalities in the classroom, I tend to sort of keep it a little bit more modest. So we have ground rules in terms of sort of respect and the treatment of others, and our obligations to each other to listen, but to avoid language that might be hurtful or damaging. But beyond that, it's that's sort of where I sort of land, I suppose. I don't know if that answers the question, Michaela.
I've got a question on the topic of responsibilities, if I can just butt in. Pete, with your model, do you find that students have a sense of responsibility? Like, do they have this kind of feeling of I am responsible, or I should be responsible, or they want more responsibility in terms of these big, huge issues that you kind of grapple with in the classroom? Because sometimes I feel in my teaching, these issues are so large, it's kind of a feeling of like deflation, like what can we do, what can I do? And I was just wondering what your experience was like.
Yeah, and that's a real balancing act, right? Because you don't want to sort of, on the one hand, overwhelm students and put it all on them, because that's not right. But then on the other, we need to be able to think about sort of our connections and our relationships to these problems in more active and attentive ways. And I think those sorts of, that sense of practices of attention, and responsibility taking is all I'm trying to sort of encourage. I mean, students really vary in their responses to this, I suppose. Some are already sort of quite committed and will always sort of come to the classroom with a keen interest, and others you can feel they struggle. It might feel a little bit more discomforting. I don't think that discomfort is necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be really productive, and just feeling intuitively as you're teaching where the sort of boundary lines are around that means you just got to have a bit of agility, I think, within the classroom space.
Thank you. Emma, have you ever asked students to suggest walk-in routes themselves?
No, I mean, their assessment is they get to do that. I always ask them about their own associations and experiences of the places that we go to. I guess if I were to do that, it does take a lot of planning, these sessions. They're in terms of the reading, and I plan these quite carefully for all. There's room in them for stuff to happen. So I would have to get in touch with students months in advance and ask them what they wanted to do. So no, I haven't, but I think that the assessment gives them the space to think about where they would go.
I've got a question for you, Emma, and I guess it speaks to what you've just touched upon in terms of like, it takes a lot of time planning, thinking about all aspects. And my question was, what do you think the main threats are in terms of this kind of innovative, creative teaching that involves like an extension of the university at a time of, cuts and cutbacks and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think, speaking from my own institution, it's a module that you can't, you couldn't take 100 students on this module. You couldn't, it wouldn't work. So it relies on being allowed to do smallish, like 20, I don't think is small. I think that's reasonable seminar size. It allows for having a high student staff ratio, and giving space for these kinds of learning. Whereas if we're just trying to get bums on seats and teach at people, we can't do this kind of work. And that's not just about walking courses. It can be about all kinds of other more creative approaches to teaching, alongside more traditional lecture formats. I think there needs to be room for this kind of teaching as well.
Thank you. Michaela, was your comment a comment or a question? Would you like me to read it out, or are you happy for it to be in the chat?
I'm happy for it to be in the chat, Carli. It's fine.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions or thoughts that you have for either Emma or Peter? That's a question to everyone.
Could I say something quickly on the crisis in student attendance?
Mm-hmm.
My course this year has, and like everybody else, we've been pulling our hair out of Goldsmiths about what to do about this. It's a sector-wide issue. This year, though, this course, it starts at 9 a.m. and they have to cross London in rush hour to get to some of the places. The attendance has been brilliant and really stable. So I think, and of course, there are cases, ill health and stuff where students can't come. But I also think that maybe moving to online to accommodate the crisis in attendance isn't always going to work for everything. And I think I do ask a lot of students in this course, but the best bit of feedback I got was from someone who said it's worth getting up early for, which was like, wow, So I think sometimes we can ask a lot of our students if we're also giving quite a lot in terms of how we're teaching them, which isn't to say that students don't turn up because of bad teaching. We know that's not the case.
Yeah, no, I think it really points to the need to kind of think creatively and perhaps kind of just mix things up a little bit, so the teaching that the students get is mixed and it's not all the same. Definitely, yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections, comments, questions on either of the papers? No. Okay. We can move on to the next paper, Rachel, shall we? And then have an earlier, longer comfort break. Do you think that would
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. So thank you everybody who's contributed so far. Our second session this morning, we've just got one presenter who's Vassilis Galanos from the University of Edinburgh, and his paper is called ChatGPTeaching or ChatGPCheating, Reflections After a Year with Generative AI in the Not So Automated Social Science Classroom. So Vassilis is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for discussion and questions. As with the previous session, Vassilis, I'll kind of give you a wave when you've got 5 minutes to go, and I'll put something in the chat. And for the audience, as before, do feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, as well as to wait until the end if you prefer. So Vassilis, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really, really honored to have my very own session, be the only person at the session. Yes, ChatGPT and generative AI and large language models. I guess this has been occupying loads of discussions in the education circles in the last 1.5 years. Perfect. Yeah, so a little bit about myself, and I should put my timer on just to make sure I am, yeah, kind of on time. Perfect. So yeah, I've started my education as an information scientist, librarian that turned into a science and technology studies, media theory, qualitative digital sociology person. I focus on historical sociologies of artificial intelligence, and I've been participating in many projects that try to blend the more qualitative aspect of technologies with the quantitative kind of outcome of technologies. I'm recently been involved with the role of generative AI in journalism, and I've been teaching several STS and internet AI or data related courses at the University of Edinburgh for a few years. Today I'm gonna focus a bit more on a postgraduate course I've been teaching for 3 years called Internet Society and Economy. So last January, not last January, but January 2023, I was probably the first at Edinburgh University to adopt ChatGPT as part of the assessment, and I'll explain what I mean by that, not in terms of assessing students using ChatGPT, but actually asking students to use GPT technologies for credit, and I'm really interested in the outcome. So today I'm going to give you 4 practical examples or recommendations on how I used it, more like strategies, not really sort of recommendations, because every course is different, obviously. And I will offer some reflections on, especially since a year has passed or more, and we kind of now understood what the technology can and cannot do, and how this technology is socially situated within a broader educational landscape. So in case some of you don't know what these large language models are, essentially you've got an algorithmic model that is trained based on very, very large linguistic data sets. And what it does is, working on some probability theory, it statistically rearranges past knowledge about text. So if you ask it to write a summary of your favorite kind of book. It will rearrange existing data that it has been trained on, and will produce something that is not detectable, say, by a plagiarism detector. And then you will be wondering whether your student has copied that from somewhere, and so on. Now, I've been arguing for a long time that we are all kind of sinners here. I call that the ChatGPT temptation. So it's not a matter of staff members sort of being afraid of students cheating. It's also something that many staff members are tempted to use as well. So it's not just about essay writing. It's not just about prototyping text or ideation for essay writing. It's also about grant writing, or even suggesting marks, writing feedback, and so on. For those of you who might have been studying the history of AI, it's a very typical kind of story that we've got very polarized kind of views on the topic. We've got the doomsayers who will say, you need to ban this technology, or we've got the enthusiastic supporters who will say, well, you need to adopt the technology, and it's a sort of deterministic kind of mandate that will need to embrace the new technology. This is a slide by my colleague and friend, Dr. James Stewart, who, together with myself and some other colleagues, we've been organizing workshops at the university, bringing together interdisciplinary groups of people, educators and students, to discuss the future of generative AI, especially in light of this. Another slide by my colleague James Stewart. So our university decided to launch free OpenAI access for all staff and students as of March. It would be worth £20 a month per student. That would cost a great amount of money per year. So the university is like, well, we'll need to strike a deal with OpenAI. Now, this is not reality yet. It's something that it's still conversation we have, but I received an email 2 weeks ago by one of the people who are responsible for this, to asking for use cases. So essentially asking staff members, what do you guys use it for? So it's interesting. So first glances matter. So when you get to see one of these texts that are produced by GPT, the results seem to be impressive, right? Thankfully, we're not in February 2023 anymore. So we have learned, most of us, I think, who have some experience with ChatGPT or similar technologies, we've got some kind of gut-like experience, an instinctual kind of thing to recognize this sort of rich tapestry type of vocabulary that GPT is producing. But these first glances matter, and that kind of shapes my entire argument. So we stay at the first glance often. Why? Because we don't have enough time to mark or to moderate or to write essays. It's part of our academic culture that demands from students to write more essays, more blog posts, more written exams, produce more text, essentially, to feed more machines. And it's a similar thing happens to ourselves, educators. So we are teaming up with mighty digital plagiarism detectors, assessing students at ever-growing speed. I've got like 200 essays to mark just in this month. So we need, and at the same time, we want to squeeze more time to produce more text for our academic development. So our journal articles, our research reports, our administrative documents. Right? So we're all part of the same game. So what I did, okay, so I'm teaching this course called Internet Society and Economy. That's a 10-week postgraduate course. It's assessed based on 2 essays, a shorter one, the longer one, plus 10 weekly blogs. It's based on internet and AI studies. Like Emma, I've inherited that course, and I incorporated more AI stuff in the curriculum. And so being an essay-based course, unfortunately no walking here, it's very much subjected to the terror and the horror of GPT technologies. So my strategy was to preempt the enemy, and the enemy is generative AI as an extension of ourselves, our society, by critically embracing it. So I adopted that idea of Margaret Mitchell and her colleagues, um, that they recommended the introduction of model cards for AI models. Essentially, Margaret Mitchell suggests that every AI model should be accompanied by a short document that audits the models and their data sets, outlines the risks or limitations and biases. And I said, well, why don't I do something similar with the way students might want to use generative AI? So already many journals have started demanding acknowledgement of use of GPT. Some authors subjected to hype have added GPT as a co-author, which is not cool because we know of all the hidden labor behind it. So I gave the student the optional audio documentation of their use of generative AI for extra credit. So essentially, if they wanted to use it, if they wanted to test it, yes, please. It's a course about algorithms. It's a course about internet and society. So feel free to assess the algorithmic output in terms of originality of content, of biases, of quality of references, and so on. And I think that this was very sociologically relevant. So often in algorithm studies, we ask students to reverse engineer an algorithm to tell how it's made, and in order to critically understand how algorithms work. And usually that's a very hard task for students because they don't like the idea of the algorithm. But this essentially gave them a more playful kind of way to work in this. I also made them aware of the hidden labor behind ChatGPT, and I also made them aware of the environmental carbon water footprint. That several studies have been published during the first year of ChatGPT's launching. Well, as a result, very few students actually used it. And in the finals, only 4 out of 104 students sort of used these kind of model cards. And many of them emailed me to apologize that they just found it too hard and not worth the time to correct all the different things. This is one of the model cards that students have written, and I found some very interesting sociological kind of insights there. So the student asked ChatGPT to make this paragraph more academic, which I found extremely interesting. The style of language that we're using is more is a token, essentially. It's something that we tokenize, and we want some text to sound more academic. There's also, the student didn't really get into the details of the references they were using. So it's interesting that even despite the existence of model cards, they the believability of the text kind of led them to let some of the important details behind. I'm running a bit out of time. I want to say that this is pretty much like this kind of mechanical assistance based on generative AI is just an extension of existing social processes. So humans that learn to write like machines, or using informal markets that help them write other machines. And these are things that we kind of don't discuss very openly. And I think that this kind of led me to appreciate more errorful or glitchy kind of approaches to writing. Strategy 2, I am not a robot. I ask them to, I challenge students, and I'm now challenging educators to compose writing or even design learning objectives and forms of assessment that demonstrate sufficient inventiveness that can't be mimicked by machines. And it's a very hard task. It's something that speaks to the sort of aura of originality, to use Walter Benjamin and Jean Baudrillard's terminology, the sort of aura where we understand the navigation between creative error and algorithmic glitch. The result was very interesting. Some students, especially in their blogs, started writing poems, they started creating videos, they made performances in class, they made drawings within the essays. And that was, I think, that most students started doing this kind of thing, like using that kind of strategy, which I found the most interesting part of the process. If you do book reviews in your as part of your assessment, we tend to do so. Instead of an essay one, students can do kind of review a book. A typical issue with generative AI is that it's extremely good at creating book reviews, and I said, you know, it's better to choose books, to select books that are less famous, less mainstream in a sense, or at least very new. So sometimes, you know, some books are under reviewed, although they're what I call sometimes hidden gems. There aren't many reviews for ChatGPT to base its text on. It might just rearrange text from Wikipedia or from the publisher's website. So in that sense, I think that there's virtue in trying and find interesting books that exist, say, in the library, or they're easily accessible online, and ask students to review something either new from a lesser known author, or from a different region, even so, less Western kind of books with less Western reviews. So and I've made some experiments. So some of the typical textbooks we have are very well reviewed by GPT, whereas the lesser known yet equally interesting books are just rearrangements of their main summaries. And strategy 4.
If you could wrap up quite quickly, Vassilis.
Yes. Wrapping up on this. So strategy 4 is to gamify these kind of reference hallucinations. I hate the term, but essentially, if you ask GPT to create references, you know that they are very they're mixed, like rearrangements of actual references, but they don't exist, but they are very believable. So what I asked you to do is to essentially search the created output, and then that kind of leads them to find more interesting references to add to their essays. And just to wrap up, there are two coincidences. The first coincidence is that this emergence of ChatGPT essay writing craze coincided with the spring 2023 marking assessment boycott. And coincident to 1st February 2024, The Guardian reported that more than half of UK undergraduates confessed to using generative AI to assist with their essays. And on the 31st of January 2024, around 2/3 of research staff found themselves, according to UCU stats, on precarious fixed-term contracts, many of which last less than a year. So I don't think that these are coincidences. And speaking from a sociological perspective, I just think that we need to revisit questions around turbo capitalism, to employ a term by Paul Virilio, in order to think about our existence as part of the academic landscape. There's something about velocity, about how much text we produce, to think there, and to ask some very basic questions such as what is sociology for, what is AI or technology for, and what is education for. Just to quote Nietzsche, pessimism is not a problem but a symptom. So we need to investigate the social conditions that lead to this situation. So thank you very much. Sorry for running a bit out of time, and I'm looking forward to Q&A.
Thanks very much, Vassilis. So we've got a few questions in the chat. Please do feel free to add to those. And maybe I'll just ask people to ask their own question if that's all right, although if you prefer not to, I'm happy to. So Carli, you're first. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vassilis, for that really interesting presentation. I think one of the key thoughts or questions or concerns that I have with AI is in terms of like its algorithms and what it throws up. And I'm really not a technological person at all, but in terms of like the politics of knowledge production, and within sociology, there's a recognition that what has been produced as knowledge historically has been from a particular perspective. And I'm just wondering, what challenges does AI throw up when we think about the politics of knowledge production and whose voices are heard and what perspectives are kind of continuously vocalized? And will AI just further increase the loudness of these perspectives and marginalized others? And I know that you made a nod to that towards the end of your presentation on like elite knowledges, so I'd be interested to hear some more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I could give a separate talk on the topic. I mean, first of all generative AI material is what I call past oriented, because it's part of texts that have been written in the past. And that's why I invited students to write to invent new types of knowledge. I've got my cohorts are consisting around of 85% Chinese students. So I've done my best to incorporate more references to China as well as India, because I've got a good percentage of Indian students as well. And I asked them when they do internet sociologies to look at Chinese and Indian social media. Chinese, particular Xiaohongshu, is a very big social medium in China, and I told them, that the internet you will see there is not the same as the internet we see, say, on Instagram or TikTok, right? So and they really like that idea, and they like to compare sort of digital landscapes. And now, obviously, China has their own kind of large language models. So now part of, I think, my next year's assessment will include sort of comparing large language models from sort of more Western and less Western kind of models. Now we've got the sort of experience. So yeah, that's very sort of freestyle answer to the question. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got a question from Stefanie now. Stefanie, would you like to ask that yourself?
Yes, it's also a chance to test my microphone finally, because I had some audio issues. It's working, yay. Thank you. So Vassilis, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was just wondering if you worry about the use of generative AI, meaning to feed the monster, in the sense that AI is getting better and better, because many of us, you hear this, oh, AI is still making mistakes, the outrage, but actually, aren't we all glad that it is making mistakes? Because if it's becoming more and more perfect, we're in a very dangerous world, and Stephen Hawking basically already predicted that we're going to be wiped out. And I'm wondering, also in the context of capitalism, marketized societies, ChatGPT is probably not going to be free to use forever. So we're feeding the monster. The monster's getting better, but it's also capitalized. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I mean, these are very important sociological questions as well, Steffi. So first of all, starting with Hawking, I think he kind of created loads of anti-hype around AI that that kind of anti-hype fed the monster, I think, because people were afraid of AI. They kind of invested even more in kind of getting it right. But I think that that actually fed the monster, together with people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates. But I think AI, as it is now, it doesn't get better. I think it becomes worse. And one of the things I didn't have enough time to speak about is this idea of the curse of recursion, or the so-called model collapse. So some people have suggested that because now in the last 1.5 years, the internet has been flooded by this kind of very bad AI made text. This now feeds back into the training of texts. And as an effect, the new texts are of even lesser quality. So now computer scientists are trying to create ways to create more variation and richness in the text, but I think it kind of reaches this point where it might be good to write up our emails, but not in terms of becoming better. You also touched upon ChatGPT being free. So ChatGPT is free, but we feed it with our data, and that's a huge power dynamic. I admit to have connected my wallet to the devil. I've got access to GPT-4 that is private, and the main difference is that if you use GPT-4, they don't use your data in order to train future data sets. It just stays with you. So it's a power dynamic there that not everyone um, can afford. And it also relates to another problem called shadow IT. And that's where the universities have this sort of power imbalance, face this power imbalance in terms of not every university can afford having their own customized version of GPT. So many university staff members or students might feel tempted to use the free version, and therefore giving away some of the data, their original ideas, their grant application ideas, their students' essays in order to write feedback to them, and so on. So that's a danger we need to address, and we need, I guess, more media AI literacy on the topic. We need to understand that every time we use the free version, it's not really free. It's actually costing lots of data, and there is what we call data capture. Yeah.
Thanks, Vassilis. Sally, you put a comment in the chat. I wasn't sure if that was a question or a comment, but if you'd like to ask a question, do feel free. Sally, do you want to shall I ask the question? Well, it's a comment about resistance to this approach by students from lecturers, supervisors, and her experience. I don't know, Vassilis, if you want to comment on issues around resistance.
Yeah, so like I said, 4 out of 104 students actually used it. I was very pleased to see that. I remember December 2022, everyone was panicked at the staff meetings. Oh, what we're gonna do? And then at the end of the day, very few people used it. So I think as staff members, we are overcomplicating things sometimes, and I think that students actually are more interested in finding in using their times as master students, to be more inventive, and they appreciate the inventiveness. As for resistance more broadly, it's a topic that I find it very interesting that it's more widely discussed across different sociological areas. At the BSA annual conference, there were panels devoted to resistance to technology, and it's just a sign of our times. People are tired, like they don't want use an online form to book a GP appointment. They don't want to use ChatGPT to write essays. They want the lived experience, the phenomenological lived experience. So I'm optimistic in that we'll see more types of resistance very soon. What we need to address, I guess, is the tension between resistance, refusal, and the bridging of the digital divide. What we now begin to realize as sociologists is that this idea that the digital divide exists, many people don't have access to the new technologies, essentially can be interpreted as a sort of mandate to upgrade and to catch up with the latest technology, which is a very Western mandate. So maybe these resistance movements kind of help us to think otherwise. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a question from Rory. Do you want to come in, Rory?
Yep, no problems. Yeah, again, thank you. Very interesting. Do you think that this means really that should we be teaching, or universities be teaching students how to use AI appropriately? I mean, I sort of have this kind of mindset of when I'm using it, I've become more of a curator rather than a creator, kind of refining and polishing. And is that something that we think we should be teaching students how to do, because it's not going to go anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess views are very polarized. So I'm all about teaching people, and I think we should teach, but the extreme version of that is what the University of Edinburgh tries to do now, to essentially, like the Financial Times, strike a deal with OpenAI, send them all past essays, all past grant applications to train their own data sets, because they can, because they're rich enough and they can do it, and then teach students how to use the official version that they are entitled to. Now, again, shadow IT. If as a student or as a staff member, I know that there are certain degrees of surveillance, and that my line manager or my lecturer will see how I use generative AI in order to write an essay or a grant application, then I might defer to the non-official version. So if Teams doesn't do the work because Teams is so bad, I might go to Zoom, and that's shadow IT, because the university doesn't give me, well, actually the university does give me free access to Zoom, but maybe I'll go to Skype, and many students will think in the same way, that maybe they don't write their own essays, maybe they don't have enough time, or maybe they've got enough money, they'll pay somebody to write their essay, right? And likewise, if the university is giving me the free version of OpenAI GPT-4, then they might just use their own private version of AI, so that they're not monitored in what they do. So it's a double-edged sword. That's, I guess, the best metaphor.
Thanks very much, Vassilis. I think we'll have to
Can I have a quick follow-up on that?
No, I'm afraid we're out of time, because we've only got a very short break and we've got to stick to time. But do feel free to put some stuff in the chat. But thank you very much for your questions and for your presentation, Vassilis. And I can see that colleagues have put some useful resources in the chat, so thank you for that. We've now got a very brief 5-minute break, so do feel free to go and grab a cup of tea, or if you'd like to. And if you could be back at 11:30, and we've got our next session starting then. So thanks everyone very much, and see you shortly.
Okay, so it's 11:30, so I think we'll get started with the next set of papers. So again, we've got 15 minutes for a presentation. We'll have the 2 presentations back to back, and then we'll have 20 minutes for discussion. So the first paper, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nazneen, Sophie Harris, and Professor Julie Scott-Jones from Manchester Metropolitan, with the paper titled "What's the fucking point in this? Using playful pedagogy to empower sociology students with quantitative methods," which I'm really excited to hear about. So I shall hand over to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Carli, and thanks for having us today. It's been a really interesting morning, lots of ideas buzzing around. And I really like your intonation, Carli. You sounded like our first-year students And this is a direct quote from one of them, although it's something we hear quite often when we start teaching first year, about week 1. Typically in lab, they've got a lecture, they're annoyed, and they get into lab and they'll say this to Nazneen or to Sophie, my co-presenters. We're going to talk about quantitative methods, and I think some of the things we're going to say might resonate with others who are involved in teaching hard to teach, hard to reach subjects like quantitative methods, research methods generally, and maybe critical theory, that sort of stuff. So if you teach that sort of stuff, you might get hopefully some ideas from us. To give you some context of who we are, Department of Sociology at Man Met is one of the biggest by undergrad numbers. We've got 550 in our first year. So we do everything we do at scale, which is quite remarkable when you hear what we do or we try to do. So we're going to talk about that. Quantitative methods is compulsory in our sociology and criminology programs through the first 2 years. And then there's a specialist route that about a quarter to a third of our students choose to take for their final year. So that's just some context about who we are. So we're going to talk about what we do and why we do it. Just to take a step back, first of all, so I'm going to have to say this, next slide, please. Thank you. There's a picture of what our students often look like after week 1 of teaching of quants, but they don't look like that by the end. The first thing we want to get everyone thinking about, and it's something we don't do enough in our sector, and certainly not in sociology, which is take a step back and reflect on what's the educational journey our students have been on before they come to us. And because we're quants teachers, we've done a lot of this kind of work, but I think it's a useful thing for us all to think about. So if you take a typical sociology student who comes to us at Man Met, or a criminology student, they come to us already with baggage and barriers to learning quantitative methods. A couple of ones. First of all, A-level sociology, which is a key pipeline into our discipline. I think it's something like, 50% of all students will have taken it. Has a particular take on what sociology is. I would argue it's quite dated. It's not empirical. There's an emphasis on qual, but it's a bit kind of pathetic, really. There's not a lot of quants there. So already our students are thinking, what's this quants thing? If we think about our discipline more generally, the cultural turn in sociology away from or critiquing the empirical, perhaps overprivileged. I don't want to start a methodological debate, so I'm being cautious. Perhaps overprivileging of qual, instantly problematizes quantitative methods. So you've got several things going on already about this part of sociology. The typical sociology student we see is usually female, from diverse backgrounds, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and has done a suite of humanities and soft social science A-levels like sociology. So they're coming from a very particular kind of take on the discipline, on education. They like narrative, they like critique potentially. We hit them in week 1 with quantitative methods as part of their core program. It looks alien, it sounds alien. This doesn't look like sociology. What the fuck is going on is quite often a thing that we say. So those are lots of barriers to learning. And the last barrier to learning that Sophie's going to talk about now is numbers, because you can't teach quants without showing them numbers. And numbers is a big, big problem. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie now to say a little bit more about that before we get into what we actually do about this.
Yeah, so as Julie said, they come with us with all this baggage. They're scared about numbers. Where do these negative dispositions come from? So as a previous secondary maths teacher myself, I've been in the classroom. I know what school pedagogy is all about. It's very, very structured. So you start your day off with a starter task, which is a recap of last week, 5 minutes maximum. You do a demonstration. The students then copy in a series of questions. You do a little plenary, and there is no creativity in that whatsoever. The most you might get is a little quiz at 5 minutes at the end, just to get them ready to get out the classroom and go away, basically. Get out the room. That's all they want to do. But there's also a lot of time pressure from the curriculum because there's a lot to fit in a short space of time. And constantly, every day, students say, maths is boring. What's the point in it? It's irrelevant. I'm not going to use this in my everyday life. And what's really striking is that if a student even is behind by one lesson, if they're off ill, because of this time pressure, they then are constantly behind. They're trying to catch up, and it is a lot for them. So what I'm interested in is how these negative dispositions of it being boring and irrelevant, how does that affect their confidence, their value of the subject, for it to then for them to use it to go into future careers, for them to go into further education, and the relevance of it. So is it relevant to everyday life, what they're actually learning at school? And what was striking was that, well, probably not surprising actually, that if they've got negative dispositions, negative attitudes towards maths, it will negatively affect their confidence, their value, and their relevance. But all these three things together affect their attainment, so how well they do at maths. So last year, 2023, only 72% of the population that sat GCSE maths actually passed, which meant they got a grade 4 or below. And that meant the remaining 28% then had to carry on doing this post-16. So when they got into college, they had to continue doing maths in some form. And if we know that this confidence, value, and relevance really affects their attainment, if they're really struggling to see the relevance of anything, they're going to struggle to pass. And they're being made to do it for at least another 2 years, okay? It's a struggle. So when they come towards at year 1, they've got these negative dispositions that we try not to trigger, but we do. As soon as they see them numbers on the screen, like, numbers, they go back to that bad experience at school. I don't see the point of it. It's not relevant. Where a student literally come to us this year and went, what's the fucking point of this? In like day 1 of lab. Because they couldn't see past the numbers, because it's never been relevant to them at any point in their life until we show them how it's done. So it requires us to teach differently than school, to not replicate that bad experience at school, and create a new pedagogic framework going forward to get them on board.
So I'm going to introduce you to Wiki, working with quantitative evidence, which is our level 4 core module that has 500 students. It is a large cohort. But what we're trying to do with the students is introduce them to quantitative methods, to numbers, and to show them that actually it's not as scary as it is, or they thought it was. And what we do is, we're covering new terminology, new software, how to interpret the numbers, in addition to kind of reassuring students that it's not actually as scary as they think it might be. And we essentially do this on our level 4 unit, but we also teach quantitative methods as a core on level 5 and level 6 as a specialism, as Julie mentioned earlier. So although I'm talking about Wiki, the level 4 unit, essentially we do this pedagogy with all of our quantitative methods modules. And the idea is that, we introduce numbers, but we're trying to tell stories with them. So we focus on storytelling, the narrative, because we need to kind of make the numbers be less scary. And the way to do that is introduce, playful ways to learn about these numbers, and, the fact that the percentages are telling a story, the people. And essentially we do this because playful pedagogy, we find, really tends to build that trust within the classroom. Students are able to explore and experiment with the data, and not really be worried. We provide an inclusive environment with the playful pedagogy that we do. So for example, it motivates them to take risks. If they're feeling challenged, that this is such a challenging subject, it allows them to, kind of experiment, make mistakes, and learn from those mistakes. And what we essentially try to do is create that confidence, build that confidence year on year. So if we create level 4 as our foundation of, what we're teaching them, then they'll continue to do that and build on that by using these playful pedagogy frameworks, which I'm going to talk to you about in just a second. We have some examples of how we actually do this. So I'll just, it worked. So some of the examples that we use to create playful pedagogy and the inclusive space is by, for example, in the first week, we'll have icebreakers, we'll play games, we'll do people bingo, random statements where we put students into groups. And if you bear in mind that this is a really large cohort, so if you can imagine 500 students are split up, but even then there's still a large number of students in one group. We still want to try and create those peer-to-peer relationships, those peer-to-tutor relationships, which is what builds that trust, makes that relaxed atmosphere and inclusive atmosphere for students. And some of the things that we encourage is for students to build communities within, their own peers as well, which is why, with the games that we do in the first week, for instance, it kind of gives the student that at the end of the first week, if they don't know anyone, if they're really scared of the subject, they've at least got 1 or 2 familiar people that they can keep coming back to in the classroom. So they've at least met 1 or 2 people within their larger cohort. One of the things that we also do is make it relevant, because when students say, what's the point of this, or what's the fucking point of this, you know, we try to show them that this is the point. We use sociology and criminology issues. We use real data, which Sophie's going to tell us about more in just a second. But the idea is that we make it relevant because it's relevant to them. It's relevant to what's happening, you know, within society, and those are the things that they're interested in. So rather than just being theoretical and abstract, they're actually practicing using data around those stories or telling those stories. One of the things that we like to do to break that tension of being a scary subject is using silly statistics. So when we introduce new terminology, new software, there's so much new learning going on. At the same time, they've got that nerves about, you know, having numbers and doing maths, even though we reassure them there's no maths involved. We use silly things such as, you know, what percentage of people drink tea, or, you know, how many people buy ramen every year, you know, just silly things that kind of just break the tension up alongside the more serious societal issues that they're looking at in the data, just because it breaks the ice a little bit. So we like to do that to kind of create that relaxed atmosphere as well. One of the things or challenges that can, I'm sure you can all probably tell with 500 students, would be how do we still make that interactive? We actually do this in many ways. One of our examples is using yes/no cards. So if you imagine a lecture theatre of 250 students, and we have to split up the cohort, we still want to make it engaging and still want to make it interactive. We still have all of the aims that we said on the outset. So one of the tools that we use is a yes/no cards, and that just means that the students who are feeling a little bit shy, not as comfortable as others, they can still voice their opinion. So we'll ask a question that can have a yes or no answer, and they're able to lift their card to say yes or no. And then if, you know, if they wanted to engage but they're not comfortable speaking, they've still been able to interact with us, and that's been really useful that we found. One of the other things that we found is quizzes. Kahoots are really helpful for many reasons. One, it makes it fun. It's a way to get them to revise the new terminology, the new stuff that they're learning, but also it can be a bit of fun. They can get quite competitive. And you know, there's opportunities to win prizes. Who doesn't want to win a prize? And again, this continues to make it more interactive for the students, despite it being such a large group together. And one of the really useful things that we found that we do is something called a green card checklist. The color might change, but the idea is that it's a checklist of week by week tasks that they do, so they're able to track their progress. So they're able to build confidence by seeing, oh, I've done this. Yes, I thought that was going to be hard, but I've done that, and they can tick it off. And they're also getting instant feedback from the tutor as well as their work is being looked at each week as well. So they're building confidence in that sense as well. And again, as we know, because it is a difficult, or they think it's going to be difficult, we try to reassure students by having open door sessions. So basically, you know, just so that there's space for them to come and talk to us, ask questions, and just continue supporting them to build that trust and that confidence.
So quickly but importantly, we want to make it relevant. And I talked before how this relevancy thing can really be a barrier. So there's two main data sets that we use in first year. One is the crime survey for England and Wales, and the other is the national survey of sexual attitudes and lifestyles. So we teach them with the data set, but they actually do the data analysis themselves. They actually get to do it. And there we emphasize the idea that it's all about finding patterns and trends in society. This is why data is important, because if we don't have the data there, we can't analyze it, then we don't know if there's anything going on. We don't know if there's any problems in society. Then us as sociologists can't do anything about it. So it's a really good gateway in. But what we find as well, that students really can pick variables. They can choose topics that they're interested in, but might be sensitive to them as well. So we feel like that really makes them engage. And one of the key things is these skills that they're learning throughout this, we make it relatable, but data skills, they're learning it from year one. And 1 in 3 jobs in Greater Manchester requires data skills. So it makes our students extremely employable. And these skills are in demand. So we see that a lot of our graduates do go into data roles, working for organisations around the country that need these skills to find out whether there's, well, what's going on in society really.
And just quickly, you know, overall, does it actually work? Does this framework work? Yes, it does, because the overall student satisfaction rate is 89%. The satisfaction with teaching is 91%. The satisfaction with the resource that we provide, 94%, and the overall pass rate is 92%. So that just shows how well this pedagogy works. And again, we've had students say that the teaching style has increased their confidence in using quantitative methods year on year. So innovative methods, even with a large cohort, is very possible and links to graduate futures in the future.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to skip straight to Stefanie, who's going to continue the discussion of quantitative methods, but through a decolonising aspect. So Dr. Stefanie Doebler from Lancaster University, and her paper is entitled Decolonising Quantitative Methods Teaching in Sociology, a Work in Progress Example. And just to remind everyone, you're welcome to post questions in the chat as and when.
Thanks very much for having me. It's an absolute honor, and it's great to see some familiar faces as well. So Nazneen, who's also a fellow decolonizer and has given a fantastic decolonizing talk at the Radstad's conference. So it's great to see everybody. So first of all, before I start, there is a photo of the Roads Must Fall protest in 2015 at the University of Cape Town on my first slide. And this goes to emphasize that decolonizing is a student-led movement. It's always been. It only exists because students have been asking all the right questions and students have been educators. And it wouldn't be there without them. So we need to be mindful not to colonize decolonizing. That would be quite a sight to behold. And this talk is about decolonizing or trying to work towards decolonizing quantitative methods teaching in sociology. At Lancaster, there is quite a large decolonizing initiative. There is events, probably hundreds of events every term, as a large community of staff and students who lead on decolonizing events. But most of it is qualitative, humanities driven, and I found at several places that I've worked so far and in quantitative sociology that I've experienced that we've been quite slow to adapt. Actually, quantitative social science and statistics and maths and stats have been quite slow to engage with decolonizing. It is slowly starting. But I have an anecdote. When I started thinking seriously about decolonizing about 4 to 5 years ago, I sent an email request to the BSA Social Statistics Study Group mailing list, of which I'm also a co-convener, and got one response by a very senior male academic asking me, why on earth do you want to decolonize? Statistics is neutral. It's a neutral method. It's not colonized. We don't need decolonizing, do we? And he was kind of playing a little bit devil's advocate because we then had a little debate around why methods are never neutral, while the tools we use are not neutral, the knowledge that we use isn't neutral, and we are never objective. There is now an evolving community in quantitative decolonizing. So Nazneen is one of them. There are some people that I'm citing on my slide, Charlotte Brookfield and Rima Saini and Fabrizio Fiallo. So there's quite a few people at different universities. It's kind of taking off a little bit, which is fantastic to see. And it has become the policy of my trade union, the UCU. I hope you can see the slides a little bit. The UCU, so what is decolonizing? And the UCU endorses Sophia Ackel's definition of decolonizing, who is at London Met University, and she's leading on a decolonizing initiative. It's about rethinking, reframing, and reconstructing curricula and to move away from this Europe-centered perspective, from this colonial lens. It's more than just diversifying, because it's trying to challenge institutional hierarchy and monopoly of knowledge and moving out of this Western framework. And so what am I trying to consider when I'm thinking about decolonizing quantitative methods in particular? Representation, as with every module, representation. Who is the canon? Who forms the canon? And who's left out? Who gets a platform and who doesn't? Ethics, ethical responsibility, and that ties in with the dark history of statistics, by which I mean eugenics. And there are other things. There's data colonialism. I can't spend a lot of time talking about data colonialism because that would be a 1-hour lecture in itself, but it kind of has to do with Western platforms hosting vast amounts of data, often coming from the global south, often coming from indigenous populations, but those populations the data is coming from often have no access, and there's a whole labor force of people who work for a pittance, for very little money, for huge data providers, but not to go into a lot of detail here. So I'm starting on my second year undergraduate modules, a new module that I've just run this year, and it's an optional module. Students can choose this. That's helpful because they're selecting in. We already have people who are interested, who aren't completely put off. That makes my life a little bit easier than the man-med team, who sometimes have this challenge that people might be very anxious of statistics and might be not so happy about it. But I start with representation and the canon. So that the classic canon, Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher, who have invented the key methods in frequency statistics that we still use. There wouldn't be linear regression without Francis Galton, because he invented it. Carl Pearson, and his Pearson's R correlation coefficient. You can see the equation just below him. He's came up with that. We wouldn't have t-tests, Ronald Fisher's t-tests, mean comparisons, p-values. Those classic frequentist statistical concepts, we use them every day. Students learn them every day, but we rarely really talk about what might be wrong with this canon. And we have three people on the slides. What do they have in common, and who might be missing here? And of course, there's someone missing, and that is Florence Nightingale, just for a start. She was a statistician and epidemiologist who wrote a fantastic book about the state of hospitals and hygiene in London, but also with her experience with the Crimean War, the state of hygiene in hospitals and mortality rates and disease. And W.E.B. Du Bois is often omitted. He's not strictly a statistician. He didn't invent any novel statistics, but he is the first Black person who got a professorship at Harvard University. But he's also the first person I know of who did, using the American census of the 1900 to 1910, using that data, and did data visualizations, hand-drawn bar charts and pie charts of ethnic, racial inequalities and racial injustice and the abolition of slavery. So he was really doing some pioneering work with very simple methods. And it's interesting that they're often really omitted from curricula in statistics. We also shouldn't be quiet about the history, because the inventors of the methods that we use are were deeply engaged in eugenics. Galton was the founding father of eugenics. You can see him sitting there on a porch. I hope you can see him with a white fedora. Can you see that? Hopefully, yeah. And next to him is Carl Pearson, his protege, who ended up funding the statistics department at UCL. And the campus is still full of these blue placards, and there has been a student movement, a protest in 2018. The university has apologized and has now renamed some lecture theatre. So there is a critique, but very often student-led. But eugenics is a racist movement, and it's a pseudoscience that believed that we can breed a better human race, and that also had very racist underpinnings. There's a chapter in Galton's book about eugenics that is explicitly saying that Black people are inferior to white people. Pearson wrote whole essays about the Jewish race being inferior. And then we can move to the right-hand side. Madison Grant, who is the co-founder of eugenics in the US, together with Charles Davenport, who wrote a book, The Passing of the Great Race, in 2016. It's one of the most racist books that ever existed. And that inspired none other than the Nazi leadership in the 1930s in Germany. So Hitler called this book his Bible. So there are direct links between eugenics and a lot of really horrible things and evils of humanity, straight to the Holocaust. And we need to include that. We need to discuss that on modules, which of course comes with its challenges, because that takes time maybe away from doing other things. Modules can be quite busy, but it is important, because the ethics of what we do is really everything, and it feeds into everything we do and how we generate knowledge. So we can't just ignore that. So this is one of the first computers that existed. It's a punch card machine. And why am I putting it here? Because it's the IBM's Hollerith computer, which was used to collect the Nazi census in 1933 and 1939 in Germany, which collected data on every household, every person in every household in Germany, their race, whether they're Jewish or not, date of birth, spouses, all their children, their address data. And that data was used to round up people and deport them into concentration camps where millions of people died. if we look at a typical computer cluster space at university, and that's just a typical space at many universities, there are computers there, and very often they are still IBM computers, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have 2 IBM computers. They're fantastic. One is from 2000 and still going strong. It's just about the materiality of the knowledge, the objects that we use, and the tools and the techniques that we use, the technologies on a daily basis when we touch those keyboards, when we use those computers. We should think, we should reflect, and the history matters, and the ethics of it matters. And this is just something we shouldn't blindly just use those tools. So I've got 5 minutes left. Carli, thanks. Okay, so my practice example, this is just a timeline. The purple boxes show the weeks in which I have an explicit decolonizing content. So I've tried, so I've got decolonizing explicitly mentioned in 5 out of 10 lectures. It kind of feeds through everything, but it's a module on exploring understanding inequalities using applied social statistics. Students use Stata as a software. They learn to write code. They learn to use to do t-testing, simple and bivariate tabulation, correlation, bivariate correlation, Spearman and Pearson. They learn, they go up until linear regression. That's where it stops. And these students have never been exposed to statistics. So there is no statistics module in the first year. And there is a research methods module, which is mainly qualitative. It's very heavily qualitative. It's beautiful, very different methods. They're using different methods there. There's a tiny bit where they do their own survey using Qualtrics, but it's not that they don't actually do any statistical analysis. So this is the first exposure, and they're doing it. But there's also, so I've tried to link this in with the theory. So when I have a session on ethnic inequality, starting with W.E.B. Du Bois and his data visualizations, in the computer session that follows, so I've got a 1-hour lecture, then a computer session after that is also an hour. They then do their own tabulations, their own bar charts, their own pie charts on ethnic inequalities in wages and ethnic inequalities in occupational status. And then they explore data on inequalities. And when we talk about disability inequalities, there is some data there they can try to analyze. It has its challenges. I mean, basically, the students liked it. They really liked it, and they were very positive about it. But one thing they did say was they would have liked to do more statistics. They would have liked to have more space to run regression models and explore that a bit more. And we know that statistics modules can be quite busy. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to learn. It can be quite overwhelming. I think they all did well. They all made it and were successful in learning those basic methods I wanted to teach them. I would have liked to be able to also introduce interaction terms, but we didn't get to there because we just didn't have time to do that. I'd rather have them learn, do a linear regression model and reflect on the decolonizing aspect. So there are some challenges with that, embedding that, and also every module is different. I was working with a cohort of 17 people. That's quite different from what the team at MMU is doing with a cohort of 200 to 500 people. Every degree program is different. How we embed methods, how we think about decolonizing. I mean, it is a collective endeavor. It's a collective thinking process that we must need to do together. And it needs to fit in with the learning outcomes of a whole degree program, with the learning outcomes of a module, with having modules talk to each other. And there's not a one passepartout recipe that you can use everywhere, because every program is different, every cohort is different. But I think there are a few things that I just did on my module that worked really well. I also think if more space is given to that, and we have more modules that speak to each other in that way, we can do even more of it. So basically, mainly, so yes, so it's kind of about challenging those assumptions and be very critical about the ethics of what we do, and to emphasize again, our tools that we use are not neutral, they are never objective, and it's very important that the students also embrace that fact. I think I'll stop here because I might be running over time. Thank you.
Thank you much, Stefanie. I'll open it up now to questions. So feel free to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand and vocalize your questions. I'll just have a look at the chat. Michaela, would you like to read your question out so I don't misread it?
Can do if you like, Carli. Yeah, it was a question from Nazneen, Sophie and Julie. I need to find it now. So I was really inspired by the kind of account of what you're doing on the QSTEP programme. But I was just wondering whether there had been related moves to kind of move quants onto the broader curriculum. Because I do think that what tends to happen, and it probably relates to an early comment that Julie made when she was setting up the presentation, that generally like understandings of methods tend to be completely divorced from our broader approaches to sociology. So we might set qualitative texts and case studies for students to read as part of a course, but we might not reflect on perhaps why those are the most appropriate in the classroom. We might not reflect on the methods at all because we're focusing on the argument and the content. So I just wondered to hit from you on whether there were broader moves more generally, and it kind of links to my very long and lengthy comment that I've made further down, which is to think about, is there more generally a conversation that we need to have as a subject around actually the position of methods teaching on our curricula? And not only the position of methods teaching, but the approaches we take to teaching methods, which do tend to single them out and present them as if they're somehow not related to what we do in our everyday life.
Hi, Michaela. That's a question we've been grappling with for a very, very long time. It's a really important one. So a couple of things. I think once, because we've been subject to time constraints, we didn't go into other detail that we do to relate the quants. And also we've got a qual module. We don't teach that, but the qual module, how they talk to each other at the crossovers between the modules. So we do a lot of that, particularly around methodology, at both first and second year. But also we do a lot of road mapping for the students about how this connects to other things that they encounter in the curriculum. So particularly in first year, we focus on NatSal and we focus on the crime solving in Wales, but we take out kind of wicked problems that are then picked up in their core theory courses. So they're substantive modules, it's similar topics that they are kind of talking about. So we do a lot of signposting. It's really hard to do. And, you know, in the nature of higher education, when module leaders change, it disrupts it. So you have to rebuild it again. So it's hard, but we do have that scaffolding. It's not perfect, but it's certainly there. It does take a lot of energy. I agree with you around kind of a lot of methods certainly in the past, you know, I certainly used to teach it like this. It was kind of a standalone thing. It was like almost like, here's the cookbook and you can do something with it, but you might not even want to open the cookbook again. And then they go off and do their sociology or the criminology. So it's really important to connect them all together, but it's hard work. I think one place where it does really come together then is in the assessments. So the way we assess both for first and second year and the specialist quants route is they have to develop a research question that has to relate to a substantive module they've done. So that's when they are suddenly drawing that learning in and framing, you know, a piece of analysis around that. That's the story bit that we didn't really talk about a lot, but that narrative that our students really like. So it's a long-winded answer. I don't know if that's such a question. I could talk about this for hours.
That's really helpful, Julie. I think my question was the other way around. Why was it? I was going to say, why are you doing all the legwork? Like, are your other colleagues also doing that legwork? Are they picking up on that? I think that's more critical than I probably.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really good point, though, Michaela, because I think the problem with anyone, I'm sure a lot of people in this call who teach, whether it's qual or quants or both, and I imagine a lot of us in this call are in that situation, have been historically. It's often the methods people who have to keep banging the drum. Methods, you know, sociology is an empirical social science. You know, it is. That's where our strengths. That's how we transform the world and change things. You know, that's our call to action. In my opinion, it is. So it has to be empirical. So, but it often falls down to the methods people to kind of push. And I you know, I alluded at the start to the kind of cultural turn in our discipline. I think that makes it hard work. We have colleagues in our department, even though we're a QSTEP centre, who are anti-method, who, you know, so these debates are part of the richness of our discipline, but they make it hard. So I think it's often the methods people who have to just keep, we're going to do it. That's just my view, and everyone's going to shout at me now.
Thank you. The next question is to both of the papers, and it comes from me. I was just wondering, given how exciting and innovative these quants programs are, do you find a lot of students then have the confidence and the tools to pick up an idea for a quant-based empirical study in their dissertation, in their final year project?
I hope so. That's the goal. I hope to get them a bit curious as to what quantitative methods can do when addressing inequalities, and how combining methods could also be really enriching. I'm really a big fan of mixed methods, and I'm hoping that some of them will write dissertations and just go on using those methods in a good way.
Thank you.
I think in answer to that question, so when obviously in our specialist quant route, they have to do a quantitative dissertation, and some of them do that based on kind of data they collect. A lot of it's secondary data, and some do placement-based work. In terms of the other students, who are about 2/3 of our program, we've seen a trend now where increasing number will use descriptive statistics, or kind of, for want of a better word, low-level quants, which they feel very confident with, to supplement or complement what they're doing in a qualitative space. So we've seen a real trend towards that. So to me, I'm really pleased about that, because that's showing that they feel confident in using those skills they've learned.
Yeah, thank you. That's something that we don't see that much in my own department at Sussex. A lot of the projects are still quite qualitative based, and I'm most comfortable with qualitative methods. But yeah, it's interesting to think about. Okay, I'll skip my other question. I just want to give other people more of a chance to ask questions. A question, I think, for both panelists, wondering how you designed the assessment for the quants module and how students found the assessment.
I can answer that for R1. So obviously we've got 3 different levels, but for Wiki, the level 4 one. So I mentioned those week by week tasks, so that's towards the overall grade, but the main assessment is a poster. So if you imagine a traditional research report with all the sections, but it's a poster instead, that's what they do at level 4. And then at level 5, they produce the actual report, a traditional academic paper style. And then on level 6, it just obviously is what Julie was just describing before, like a dissertation based on either SDA or placement. But that's how we do it. And so they kind of, the way we do all of ours, because we connect each year to the next year, so they're learning skills and they're developing skills that will be useful for the following year as well, and it continues on like that, and that's how we build ours.
Thank you.
So my module is a much smaller module, and it's optional, but they're doing a research report at the end of the module where they're exploring a descriptive piece of analysis. They are also allowed to try some regression modeling, and it's not so much about how perfect they do it, but about exploring it, about thinking through it, and showing me their thought process, showing me their code, how they did it. And they can pick any of the topics that we've talked about on the module. If they want to use a data set other than what we've covered, and I don't encourage that, but if they absolutely insist on doing that, they can, but they need to discuss it with me, because that has its own challenges and needs to be done ethically. So, and that is working quite well, but it's a classic research report in quite a classic format. If I had a larger cohort, I think a poster would be much better. So that's a really great idea, Nazneen. Having posters. I was wondering, can I ask a question for Team MMU?
Please do.
Because this is really interesting. Do you have any GTA support in on the module, or any teaching assistant support in marking as well? Because I know this is a hell of a lot of work.
I was going to say, Julie, do you want to take that one?
So the way that we teach in all our modules actually here is we team teach everything, because we've got so many students. So if you imagine, we have our biggest lab sits 80 students, I think it's 80. So in that space, you would have for the full-time team, full-time academic team, but you would also have PhD students supporting. And that's really good for them because the students relate to them and it supports their progression. The other thing we do a lot of is peer-assisted learning. So we pay and train our final year quant students to support in first year, and they're fabulous, actually. They're better than the rest of us at teaching and supporting, I'd say. So we do have an army of people to support. So those of you on the call thinking, God, 500 students and 2 people, we have better student staff ratios than that. We do a lot of support, and that's really important for students learning this stuff.
Just add on to that as well, I think we, Nazneen mentioned before, we do open door sessions, and we found they're really successful with our students. So each week, each member of staff will have an hour blocked out where any student from any year can come in and they can ask questions and they can get us to clarify things. And we found that that's really, really helpful in one, helping them each week if they need anything clarifying to keep scaffolding each week, but also in terms of the assessment and actually submission rates as well for the assessment, because they know they feel comfortable with us to be able to ask them questions. We found that really useful as well.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of comments that I'll read out and then I'll jump on to the next set of questions. Just some comments about the importance that, you know, quantitative methods is not neutral or apolitical. And then some other comments around, quantitative methods module should never be just technical. And the need to kind of take a step back and flesh that out and convey that to students as well. And again, a comment from Michaela about the responsibility not just falling on the shoulders of a few, but that, you know, making quantitative methods accessible, digestible, fun, problematizing them, decolonizing them should be kind of the responsibility of everyone in the department. And that's a nice ideal that we can strive for, no doubt. Okay, so I have a question. Presentations are inspiring. A detail: when you use the yes/no cards, do you distribute 200 plus cards to each student and collect them back after each class? So a real practical question there.
Yes, so it'll be a lecture theatre. So one of us will be setting up the slides and the other one will be giving out the cards, and at the end we'll collect them back in. Yes.
Can I make one point?
Yes.
Sorry, one
yeah,
point.
go on, Julie.
In the slideshow, you saw a picture of the yes/no cards. If you saw the picture that was in the slides, if you wonder what that was, one of the things about the yes/no cards that's really cool is they work even if technology fails in lecture theatres, which is great. But the other thing is they tend to get a community feel. So if you think of rows in a lecture theatre, someone from each row will go down and get their row's cards. So in a really nice way, the first years are talking to each other and they're passing them out. And they get quite comical with the cards as well. So if they don't know the answer, they often turn them upside down. So there can be a lot of play with that artifact. And
yeah,
it's which I love.
And just to add to that, sometimes if they want to answer something, but then, like, you know, they'll hide their face and still answer it. So they'll hide their face with the card. And you know, but it's still a really good way for them to engage, because even though they're hiding their face, they're still answering and being a bit silly with it. But it's fine. We encourage that.
Carli, can I just pick up the point that you made about narrative before? And one of my issues in the past, and I've taught methods, both kinds of methods for a long time, is the mistake that people have often made is making it very technical. So it's a technical, and actually we flip that. So it's about, you know, thinking of the students we get, you know, they like the narrative, they want the story, they want to call to action. So that is the thing that we center stage. I think Steffi makes that point as well. That's the key thing for sociology students to learn quants. It's not the techie stuff. They're not interested in that. It's the story. It's what's this for? What's this going to do? And that's really crucial. I think also for qual, personally.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's really interesting in terms of, like, just to go back to the point about the cards, we've got this huge kind of like incentive or push to kind of use things that are more remote in terms of, like, you know, using the mobile phone, but actually something as old school as a bit of paper can facilitate so much more than just answering a question, and the micro politics of making students feel more at ease and more comfortable, more collaborative, which was really interesting to hear about. Jamie, would you like to read your question out?
Yeah, thanks, Carli. Yeah, so it's more about, in fact, picking up on Julie's last point, really, about the story and catching the different ways in which you can catch students' motivation and imagination. And I think for both sets of talks, which would be great, this is a really relevant question. But Steffi, I particularly liked about the decolonising is the way in which students have to see what quants has done in the past, that it does make a difference in the world, and that can be very negative in some ways, for those past illustrations that you gave, and just kind of putting that in their face. And then them possibly seeing that they could use quants in the future and in other ways to make a political difference. And I'm just wondering whether that is something that captures the imagination of your students, and you find is a kind of motivating thing coming out of the module, that they're able to see how quants can make a difference, and they could use it to for their own sort of their own political motivations.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jamie. That's a brilliant question, and I completely agree with you. I think there are some challenges. There is a lot of anti-positivist bias. And I mean, I've yet to meet any quantitative sociologists who call themselves a positivist. I see myself as a critical realist, but there is this, students come with a lot of anxiety or dislike of numbers, but there's often maybe staff influencing or people, what they read, influencing them with an anti-positivist bias, in the sense that, for example, often Audre Lorde's quote is used in discourses, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but that's one of the most beautiful quotes and one of the most misunderstood quotes by an intersectionalist, because she didn't say we shouldn't use tools and we shouldn't use method. She actually said we should be inclusive, we should invite people to conferences, we should discuss with each other, we should meet on an equal plane. And I think that my module kind of tries to do that and tries to inspire that a bit, and students liked it. They liked that it engages with decolonizing, which is already covered on other modules as well. So other modules also talk about Kimberly Grenshaw's work on intersectionality. Other modules already have some readings, and I have some others. So it tries to talk to each other a bit. And I'm hoping that I'm reducing a bit of that anti-positivist bias. I don't like the word positivism, but that's kind of the narrative, and people get open-minded to just using knowledge, using tools, because we all need to reflect on our colonialism, and it goes across all our disciplines and across everything we do. So I think I'm hoping that they do more quants, because I like quants and I like marking quants more than but I just like it more. So more students doing that would be great.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but we've just got one more question, so I will throw it out there just for a very quick response. The question is broadly about the interactive element. Has there been any resistance from students, particularly post-COVID? I wonder whether it takes a lot of work and encouragement from the start to get that energy going, and in terms of maintaining attendance. So quick responses would be great to that question.
We certainly haven't had a post-COVID issue at all. We were one of the first to go back onto campus. The thing that we find the students really like the idea of the lecture and the spectacle of the lecture. So lots of stuff going on. I like the idea of the spectacle, the lecture with spectacle idea, and design. So the team designs lectures in that way. So why would you not want to attend that? So they have still very high levels of attendance. Even for a first year quants unit. So that's maintained through most of the semester. So I think it takes a lot of designing, but once you've got it and you've got something that works, which Nazneen and Sophie has, they teach the first year, I think, it's worth putting that extra work in initially.
Thank you. Okay, Rachel. Oh, Stefanie, did you have anything to say to that, or?
No, not really, other than I might like to steal some of your tools, your yes or no cards. I was really intrigued by that. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, I'll wrap up the quant session. Lots of interesting ideas, and yeah, it's made me excited. I'm not actually teaching quants at the moment, but it is exciting to hear about it. I will hand it over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Carli. Yeah, really interesting discussion there, and thanks for the great presentations. So moving on to our final session of this morning, although I think now it's officially the afternoon, we have got 3 colleagues who are going to talk about innovative practice, and they're colleagues that we actually invited to be part of this session. Most of it was done through an open call, as you know, but we were aware of their work and thought it'd be really interesting for people to hear about. So we're going to adopt the same format as before. People are going to speak for 15 minutes. We'll run those in consecutively and then have 20 minutes for questions and answers and discussions. And we encouraged the panelists to be creative in how they presented their work. So there might be some slight variation from conventional slides, but Gemma, I'm really pleased to welcome you. Gemma Hearne is at the University of Liverpool, and her presentation is called Living Lab at Liverpool, Studying Society.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm just working out in my new Zoom setup how I'm going to share my screen, so do bear with me just for one moment. Hopefully it will do so. Brilliant. Can everybody see my slides now?
Yeah, that looks perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So huge thank you for inviting me to be part of this today. It was fascinating listening to those panels, and in particular the panel that's just gone before, the quant panel. I've been scribbling notes furiously, and I'll pick out a few key things that you've said there in relation to this, and I will stay within the 15 minutes. But if at any point I start going over, then please shout at me, because that is not my intention. So I'm really keen on doing things differently and pulling different things together. And so I think this speaks well to the 2 panels that have just gone before me. And in particular, that idea of methods telling a story, and getting rid of the idea that we have to be fixated on the technical, and thinking, you know, we need to show students what they can do with methods, because that gets them interested, that empowers them to make positive social change in the world. And it also, you know, it improves attendance. It makes them want to be part of our community more. So all these other important facets of it. So the front image there is me at an event that I ran on Wednesday night, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's part of this module. So I'm trying to flip across and it's not working. Are my slides flipping across your side?
No, sorry.
And now it's completely stuck. If they don't, I'll just speak to this, but I did want you to see the other slides. So sorry if it doesn't. So my first year module is a core module called Studying Society for 272 of our sociology, social policy and criminology students here at the University of Liverpool. So most of the students on our programmes are studying this module. Of course, we've got different joint and combined honours students where this might not be a core requirement, but for most it is. So we've got 272 students. I appreciate Met seem to have even bigger cohorts than us. So it's really good to hear that you can deliver things in an innovative way. This module involves a grand challenge of students working with careers and employability and the Civic Data Cooperative. The Civic Data Cooperative are housed here at the university. They were housed within the Institute of Population Health. They've now grown too big for that and they're housed elsewhere. And we've also been working with Liverpool Combined Authority. The idea for this is giving students a tangible real-world problem to work on, and all the research method training that they get at this foundation first year module. It can help them start to think about what they would do about this problem. So we got the grand challenge from the Civic Data Cooperative for students to investigate digital inequalities in Liverpool City region. Our students then chose different parts of that they would like to look at, including educational inequalities, barriers for elderly people, barriers for people in claiming benefits, and so on. They could choose what they wanted within that broader umbrella. And the idea of this is also working holistically with different teams around the university. I'm completely against this idea hopefully many of us are, this hierarchy of academic staff and staff doing other jobs around the university. We work really holistically with careers and employability, the library team, money and guidance team, student experience team, the attendance team. We like to work with as many different teams as we can. And if my slides had flipped across, which they hadn't, I've drawn a little diagram there of all the different teams we work with, including widening participation team, go higher team, pretty much anyone that wants to work with us to think about this. And the idea for that is that there's 4 strands for the module. So we just try and do a lot. It's research methods, but it's also critical study skills, and it's also embedded employability, and it's also about community and belonging. And of course, that last one is so important and integral for everything that we do, particularly in this post-pandemic, post-disaster period. A lot of people don't give this period the language and the understanding that it needs. I'm very much influenced by the work of Professor Lucy Easthope, who is the country's leading disaster and emergency planner. And at our event on Wednesday night, she was one of the guest speakers, talking about the need for radical change in education in this post-disaster period. We know that students aren't using campus in the same ways. We know they've got completely different needs. We know a lot of the loss and the grief of the trauma that they've experienced during the pandemic and from our response to the pandemic as well. So we know that we need to really encourage and bolster community and belonging. And part of this module is students working in small groups. It's a year-long module. So in the first semester, I very much start to encourage working in study pods, working outside of timetable sessions, and also thinking in terms of accessibility, thinking of how they will meet the needs of students in their teams who can't travel to campus, who are finding that very difficult, setting up separate meetings to meet with those peers on Zoom or Teams or however they want to meet. In the second semester, in week 1, that is where we launched this grand challenge. We had 10 members of staff, including academic staff, people from employability, Civic Data Cooperative and Liverpool Combined Authority to say what they wanted us to be looking at. And the idea of this is that students are identifying a social problem that's worthy of sociological or criminological investigation, that they are then, through their own research, setting out to substantiate why that is an issue, using both qualitative and quantitative data. And they are then thinking, well, hopefully we empower them, because then they're asked to provide a solution, a service, a product, or an intervention. Some people really like that idea of enterprise learning and entrepreneurialism. I appreciate we're all sociologists and criminologists, so there is also critique of that, which we can talk about in the questions, of course. But the idea of it is getting students to be empowered and think about what they can do with methods, and also in general. A lot of students do want, we offer a lot here. We offer a lot in terms of extracurricular activities, but of course, that isn't going to meet the needs of students with caring responsibilities, commuter students, disabled students, all those living with chronic illnesses, in particular in this post-pandemic, post-disaster period. So it's giving students as much as we can embedded within the curriculum. So the students are mainly working in small groups, but I also give them the option to work on their own, particularly if they've got a learner or support plan that makes working with others in a group difficult. You know, I'm really keen on making things as accessible as possible. We also have explicit re-engagement points in the semester. So I've worked really closely with the student experience team and attendance team. Just, you know, to share some data, over 20% more students are attending this first year modules workshops than other first year module seminars and workshops. Of course, there can be a lot of different reasons for that. I appreciate that's a very blunt tool, but a lot of this is about students feeling more confident because they're working with peers. You know, some students don't want to even come to campus. They find it very difficult to actually access teaching rooms, teaching spaces. So it's a way for us to be able to manage that and to have those regular recontact points where I very explicitly advertise, you know, we don't live in a perfect world. And if you haven't managed to attend, and maybe you haven't spoken to the student support team, or you haven't let me and my co-module leader know, then now would be a really key time for you to come back. And that has worked really well. We've had students really up until the end of the module re-engaging for a range of reasons. And some have used, you know, our extensive online materials and so on. The students were to prepare a digital pitch that was 5 minutes long, mostly as a group, but some as individuals. And that was prepared for the week before Easter, for the week after Easter break, week 9. The idea being that for most students, that then would mean that most of their research had been undertaken by that point, and they would have the remaining 4 weeks of semester to get feedback, to use our quite extensive support in writing up their 2,000-word portfolio. And the 2,000-word portfolio is split into 2 in terms of the research that they've undertaken, qual and quant, and also a critical reflection of the digital pitch, learning from others, developing key skills, including leadership skills, including adaptability, negotiation, giving and receiving feedback from others, and speaking to a wide range of audiences. We had a co-curricular part of the module as well. So students were offered the opportunity to put their pitch forward to be considered for shortlisting. And students that did that and were shortlisted were invited to Hope Street Hotel, which is a venue just around the corner from campus here in Liverpool, on Wednesday, the 1st of May. And I can send these slides to people who want them afterwards, because I appreciate the slides have not moved on. And those students pitched their idea to 150 guests. These are first-year students. None of them had worked in a group before in this way. None of them had done a presentation before. So that was quite amazing. And they pitched to a range of stakeholders from the Liverpool City region. We also had academics joining us from a range of different universities as well to support us. And those different teams that we work with from across the university were also in attendance. So that was like really amazing to showcase what we can do, but also showcase what sociologists can do. It did help us network even further, and really hopefully put sociology, criminology and social policy on the map. And on that title image, you can see that the title of the event there was Connecting Communities, Tackling Digital Inequalities Across Liverpool City Region. So it was a really great event. The winner won a summer internship with Liverpool Combined Authority, and all the other finalists also have been matched up with a placement or opportunity of their choice to do with the topic that they were looking at. So that was brilliant. I'm keeping my eye on the time. Something else as well that I've been doing in this creative vein is my alternative dissertation module, Creative Consultant, where students work cross-faculty with engineering students. And I put something in the chat box, which hopefully sent before I opened this slide deck up. So there's more information there and a video. And that is about sociologists being able to see things differently, to be able to critique what the engineers are doing and adding value to the things that they're doing. So engineers doing amazing work, looking at things like solar power in countries internationally, looking at wind power and how that helps us with our sustainability agenda, looking at things like the circular economy and plastic use on campus. Our students took those ideas, were inspired by them, but then it meant that our students were oftentimes looking at things like food poverty in the UK and social policy and raising awareness of that. And one of the students this year, they just handed their portfolios in yesterday, used the idea of plastic waste and the circular economy to try and make a prototype of a school uniform using the recycled plastic filament and raising awareness of school uniform poverty here in the UK and in the Merseyside region. Other students looking at greening spaces and trying to reduce violence through the greening of spaces. So they took what the engineers were doing and put their own spin on it, essentially, looked at things like class, disability, gender, and just looked at the ethics more broadly of what engineers are doing. Really great exchange, really great way of getting the students to see themselves as not just part of our community in SSPC, but part of the university community. And again, being very confident in speaking to people from across the uni, people from a completely different discipline, and therefore being very knowledgeable, being very comfortable and confident in about what they bring to the table and what they're saying. So that is a really exciting module to work on as well. And as I say, that is a third year capstone module, and it's an alternative to the traditional dissertation module. So I'm aware of time, and I am gutted that all the slides didn't work, but I can share them with any interested parties. So I don't know if you want me to hand back over to you.
Thanks for your great talk. And yeah, do put questions for Gemma in the chat that we can come back to. But we're going to move on to our second presentation now, which is by Michaela Benson from Lancaster University on podcasts in the classroom and on the reading list.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to all the speakers who have presented before me. I'm going to do something a bit different. Everyone else is focused on the classroom, but I'm going to, although despite the title of my talk, I'm going to talk about producing podcasts to use in the classroom. And this is drawing on my practice with the podcast Who Do We Think We Are, which is a podcast that questions taken for granted understandings of race, migration and belonging, with a particular focus on the UK. And I just want to do a quick shout out. I do produce this podcast, but there are lots of other people who are involved with it. George Kalibis, who worked with me as a podcast researcher in seasons 1 and 2. Ala Surya, who has worked with me on a spin-off project called Beyond Headlines. And my colleagues from the MIGZEN research project, Nando Sigona, Elena Zambelli, who I know is here today, and Catherine Craven, as well as a student intern, Neve, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who worked with me and Ella in summer 2022. And the actual producer, the person who does all the technical side of things, Emma Halton, as well as, I think, 30 to 35 guests who've appeared on the show. So this is really, really important. So what I want to do is to think about how these kind of non-academic outputs we produce can be optimized for use in learning. And for me, this is really important. My title is Professor in Public Sociology. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, both in my day job, but also in the work that I do as Chief Executive for the Sociological Review Foundation. And I think it's really important that we remember that as academics, primary audience tends to be students as well as other academics. So I think that's quite significant. And I think that when we're thinking about those non-academic outputs and how we might optimize them for learning, I think this is a slightly different process to how we approach writing, for example. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of where I've gone over 3 seasons and how that's been accommodated by changes in the podcasting landscape and with conversations with other academics who use the podcast in the classroom, but also with students. So I'm going to start by playing this, hopefully this will work, this very short clip from one of my guests in season 2, Olivia Allerton. Olivia was at the time a 3rd-year geography student at Newcastle University, where they'd been using the podcast as a digital or virtual field trip. So here we go.
If you want to start off thinking, right, what's out there currently, where can I go from here? What more can I read to build on it? A podcast is just the perfect place. Even if you're listening to it while going on a walk or something, it's like you can just get almost a snapshot of it. If you want to.
So for me, this is kind of, we'll come back to this in a bit, but this quotation has really left me thinking since Olivia joined me on the podcast to talk about it. So let me just talk a little bit about what the podcast looks like, what the narrative looks like. We've heard a lot about narratives today in terms of teaching, but there is a narrative at the heart of a podcast, a narrative structure at least, or at least in mine. And the framing that I came up with right from the start was breaking up what tends to be 40 to 50 minutes into smaller bites, I suppose. And this includes like an explainer that would go into some background or some context about the topic that we were talking about. Or it might break down a key concept that we want to address. It would also go back to the archive. One of the things I was very keen to do was to highlight how some of the things that we're seeing around us today, around race, migration, belonging in the UK, particularly post-Brexit, have connections to things that have happened before, and to remind students and listeners that resistance to that is not new, because that was also something that I could see happening in the world around us, like this shock that people would resist bordering or these kinds of things. So to kind of bring to the surface some of those forms of resistance as well. It would include an interview with a key figure, normally an academic or a lawyer or an NGO. And then there's work to wrap all of this together. So wraparounds where you kind of liaise from one section to the next. So there are a lot of tools that we can take from our writing practices which might help in terms of developing this kind of narrative. But you know, putting it all together in this way was certainly something that I found quite interesting to work with and took some time to come up with. So this is a narrative structure that's designed to go in depth, but to allow different entry points onto a concept. The concept is often the starting point for each episode. And I think that this is something that sets it apart from some of the more interview-based podcasts that are out there. We're not just discussing an issue in the context of this particular podcast, but how social science knowledge and understanding might be valuable in thinking otherwise about it. So that idea of debunking, of myth busting, that's really, really front and center in the way that I think about it, has been critical in terms of thinking about how I construct this. So, you know, tackling head on some of those myths. So when I started this, I had this grand ambition that this would be a podcast that could just attract the general public more generally. And I did quite a lot of work, I would say, to think about what that would mean in terms of bringing the audience along. So, for example, I know about sociological jargon and the need to break that down. So I spent a lot of time breaking down those kinds of ideas so that people could understand what we were talking about, because we do tend, even in the classroom, to take for granted that even students understand what we're talking about by the terms that we use. So that was part of the rationale between having these explainers. The archival part of it is a way of giving examples that could bring the arguments in the episode to life. But I suppose it's also to go back to what Pete was saying around bringing into parallel different cases. It is partly to do with that, to shift the exceptionalization that can come along with that, the kind of particularism of a particular case, but also to kind of take some of the, it's not take the heat out exactly, but I think when we're talking about current issues, it is useful to look at similar issues that have gone before to kind of to encourage people back into those current issues in some respects. The interviews offer a way of hearing firsthand from experts. And I think that especially with the academic interviewees that I've had, this has been a really good way of encouraging people to think off the page. So I spent a lot of time preparing interviews in ways to actually draw out key arguments from people in their work and make sure they were clearly communicated in short sections, which of course we don't necessarily do on the page in that way because the page is much longer in lots of ways. So the bits around the edges, those wraparounds, those provided an opportunity to kind of signpost, to offer summaries of arguments and new directions of thinking. But alongside all of this, aside from the audio content that there is with a podcast, I produce transcripts, I produce show notes, I produce recommendations for listening and reading from both academic and non-academic sources. And as you can see on this slide, a set of active listening questions. So some of these things developed as I went along, and part of it was to do with thinking about what it means to put a podcast onto a reading list. So my very simple idea when I started to put podcasts onto the reading list, which started when I moved to Lancaster in 2021, was that I wanted students to have the opportunity to engage with content on the curriculum through other means than sitting down and reading a paper. And I started to put a podcast a week onto the curriculum. I started to refer to them in lectures, but I don't think that at that time I'd fully thought through what the challenges might be for students in terms of being presented with an unfamiliar way of engaging with this. So what I realised was that, certainly that students needed the transcripts. I was already producing them for my own podcast, but for other people's podcasts, it's quite difficult for them to do that. Not everybody had the kind of resource level that I did to be able to do that. But students don't really know how to engage these alternative forms in their studies, or indeed how to engage with them in the first place. So this was a reminder to me that when we incorporate new modes of learning onto our syllabus, we need to provide guidance on how they should be used. And actually, this kind of builds on practice I've adopted for many years. I never even take for granted the idea that students know how to read, or what we mean when we tell them to read, let alone necessarily know how to cite. And certainly when we move outside of traditional academic texts, citing becomes quite a messy and grey area, both for academics and for students. But I was also inspired to think about how I could deepen student engagement with the podcast. And so when Niamh Welby came to me in her third year to work as a student intern, that was a really good way of hearing live from her about what she would find useful, how she might encourage her peers to listen to a podcast or to understand the value of a podcast there. And she really worked intensely on the development of the first set of active listening questions which were intended to guide students through the podcast. And it was really nice to hear from her. If you listen to the episode that Olivia's in, which is season 2, episode 10, you'll hear from Niamh as well. And she explains how this worked as a way of making things more approachable, of hearing from people in these different ways, and of actually working that closely with the podcast, where she was preparing transcripts, where she was writing those questions, really made her grasp the ideas there. So I'm probably rapidly running out of time. I've gone far too much into that. So a few benefits of doing this. This was a question I was asked to answer. I think that there really is something about hearing from scholars in their own words rather than words on the page. So being able to bring those voices into a classroom or beyond the classroom for students was really, really valuable, I think. It's a different way of engaging. So one of the things that I got from both Olivia and from her lecturer, Michael J. Richardson, was about how they were taking that podcast and they were walking in the world with it, to go back to some of the things that Emma Jackson was saying earlier. So it becomes a way of incorporating academic knowledge into everyday life in a way that reading doesn't necessarily permit us to do, because it does require that we disengage from everyday life. And I think that there's some value in that different focus as well. It also shows that sociology does happen and matters outside of journals, books, and classrooms. And I think that that's really important, because what we were doing was taking concepts and applying them to historical or current cases to offer students with opportunities to understand that these academic ideas actually do have a wider resonance. And I think that, particularly on a topic like migration, where there's so much headline news day in, day out, it offered a way of encouraging students to listen differently, to go beyond those kind of very loud voices, and to bring in a kind of a more intimate sense of what the issues were, where you're communicating indirectly, admittedly, but communicating with them as individuals, which is quite different to what we do in the lecture theatre. And in terms of benefits for me, which I think is really important, when we work on projects like this, we do have to think about, what the outcomes are for me. It's actually really helped me with my writing. It's helped me with my teaching a lot, because it's made me ask questions about how I present things. So the final question I was asked to answer was what the challenges were. I think the challenge that I hope I overcame ultimately was to find ways of encouraging students to learn differently. And for me, that does require thinking properly about how we embed not only new types, new modes of academic work, but also other ways of learning into the curriculum. And we're currently working on this in the development of a MOOC, a Maths Online Open Course, which is one of the outputs from the MIGZEN research project. And how we're approaching this is a bit different to how I would approach writing a module, for example, because we're thinking about how to integrate content from the podcasts into the design and delivery of the content through the course. So starting with those podcasts rather than with readings, for example. But I think that one of the major challenges that I've faced, and I know that other academic podcasters are facing, is to do with this hierarchy of values that is at play in thinking about the kinds of outputs we produce or what goes onto a reading list. And there's certainly, we see that kind of continued, and there is a place for journal articles, but there is a certain amount of fetishization of journal articles. I hear from students all the time that they're being told that when they put a blog onto their bibliography, that they're being told it's not sufficiently academic enough, even if they've then incorporated a range of different kinds of outputs, and even if that blog maybe appeared on somebody's course reading list. So this is a challenge, I think, for us as a subject community, in terms of thinking about how other forms of outputs that haven't reached the level of prestige that we associate with journal articles or monographs is how we incorporate those and how we encourage students to use them, what's an appropriate way of using them and reporting on them. And finally, in terms of the challenges, hearing back. Now, one of the things that you have when you have students in a room is that you are in a position where, they're your captive audience, right? So you can sit there, you can get some feedback, after class, through those module evaluations, whatever you like. But one of the challenges with podcasts, other than when you use them yourself in your own classrooms, is that you're actually one step removed from the students that you might be engaging with. And so that can be quite tricky in terms of getting feedback that can feed into future practice. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities around bringing podcasts into the classroom, about producing podcasts for student use. But I do also think that it requires quite a lot of thinking in terms of how we embed that, not just how we produce them, and also how we develop our practices around that. So thank you very much. And I think I'm 1 minute over time.
Thanks very much, Michaela. That was great. Okay, do put any questions for Michaela in the chat, and we'll move on now to our final presentation for today, which is Carli. You know Carli already. She's at the University of Sussex, and her talk is called Adopting a View from Within, Exploring Class Inequality from a Working Class Perspective. Thanks, Carli, when you're ready.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just sharing my screen. Can everyone see my slide? I also just have one slide.
Yeah, that's good, thank you.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to talk about a module that I designed in collaboration, in co-creation with a group of working class students at the University of Sussex. It came out of lockdown, not just because of lockdown, but I think what lockdown did is it gave me more time to think and problematize the way in which I teach and do things. Perhaps in a way that I wouldn't have had the time to stop and it up. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've kind of conceptualized to be a view from within. I'm just going to speak a little bit about the pedagogical kind of underpinnings about the project. Then I'm going to talk about how class has been approached sociologically within a discipline and how it's been taught. And then I will talk particularly about my module, which is entitled Class, Culture and Conflict, A View from Within. So higher education, despite the massification, it still remains a deeply classed pathway. And sociological research has kind of alluded to the various ways in which, for working class students, university study is something that's alien, unfamiliar, quite risky, academically, socio-culturally or otherwise. A lot of my pedagogy has been inspired by critical kind of feminist pedagogies of change. So I just want to spend a moment reflecting on the work of bell hooks that has underpinned a lot of my approach to teaching within the university. And bell hooks has reflected quite a lot on the role of class in the classroom and the need for academics to confront class in the classroom. And she talks about how class shapes biases that inform the way knowledge would be given and received within the classroom. Yet she also goes on to mention how that despite the fact and the way in which and the power that class has to shape and inform the way knowledge is constructed and given, there's very little criticism of this. There's very little criticism of the bourgeois class biases shaping and informing pedagogical processes in the classroom. And she goes on to argue that there is little or no discussion of the way in which the attitudes and values of those from materially privileged classes are imposed upon everyone via biased pedagogical strategies. And whilst bell hooks was largely reflecting on kind of the etiquette and modes of decorum within the classroom, she also alludes to the need to consider what is taught within university spaces, as well as how it is taught. And encourage us to alter the bourgeois setting in which we and they as students and educators enter. And she also points to the fact that academic work processes is essentially antagonistic to the working classes and academics for the most part. She argues live in a different world of culture, different ways that can make it too antagonistic to working class lives. And I just want to speak a little bit about how social class has been approached sociologically within the discipline, and also how it's been taught and understood across the academy as a whole. And I've got some quotes there on the screen that you can see, and these quotes really just reflect the kind of the ethos of the module as a whole and the ethos of this project of trying to kind of take a view from within when we look at class and class inequality. There's a picture there of Valerie Walkerdine, whose first quote is there, and she speaks about how the academy as it currently stands is the bastion of class knowledge. And when I read that, it particularly struck me. It's always been a process and a site of class knowledge, in terms of what we teach and how we teach. And for me, I wanted to kind of turn that on its head and go beyond the academy and go beyond kind of this kind of idea that only credible knowledge is confined to the university setting, which speaks to Michaela's earlier point around these kind of still very entrenched hierarchies of kind of outputs. So that's quite important to think about as well. Class as a core conceptual tool within sociology has been central to the discipline, but it's also overwhelmingly, by and large, been kind of explored from this kind of image of the privileged academic looking out of the ivory tower. And whilst we've had calls to decolonize sociology, rightly so, the inclusion of greater kind of indigenous knowledges and epistemological pluralism, or what Connell refers to as the whole world, there's not been kind of in equal measure calls to question and critique and to problematize the very fact that, you know, these working class other knowledges that exist are marginalized, if not largely silenced within the academy, and to question what is produced in terms of like the classed kind of paradigm within the sociological canon. And for me, this raised important questions in terms of the politics of pedagogy, just as it does the politics of knowledge production, and to kind of take a step back and ask what knowledge is being taught, from whose perspective and from whose classed perspective, and what impact does this knowledge that's being taught from a particular class perspective have upon student learning and issues of exclusion and inclusion within the classroom and within the modules and our readings. And that's when I kind of wanted to kind of reflect and reconsider what I teach and how I teach, specifically in the context of this class, culture and conflict module, a module that looks at class inequality within sociology. So I've mentioned that class is a key conceptual tool, and also that when we kind of grapple with some of the founding texts of sociology, they can sometimes be overwhelmingly convoluted, inaccessible. Sarah Burton has spoke about how a lot of kind of the founding foundations of sociology has been taught and established through this kind of white boy theory, the sociological canon deriving of mainly white middle class male thinkers. And also with this, class within the context of kind of academic understandings, as well as dominant discourses, has been kind of through this narrative of pathologization, homogenization, a discourse of derogatory stereotypes that kind of perpetuate negative and harmful understandings, and ignores the plurality of working class lives. We have, you know, a lot of really profound feminist academic studies into working class lives. So thinking about Skegg's Formation of Class and Gender, Kirstine Patton's Gentrification of the Working Classes, Lisa Mackenzie's Getting By, for example. But these, by and large, are the most part exceptions rather than the norm. And what I wanted to do through class culture and conflict is really kind of foreground working class life in a way that foregrounds working class voice. And that's basically what it means to take a view from within. So I understand and conceptualize this idea of taking a view from within to refer to the act of exploring a phenomenon, academically or otherwise, through the eyes of those who have experienced it firsthand, those who look out rather than look in and down from the outside at particular phenomenons that as sociologists we're so interested in kind of exploring. So adopting a view from within, for me personally, is about a proximity spatially and effectively to the issues that as sociologists we explore and address. And also adopting a view from within, for me personally, is about recognising, as Michaela has kind of nodded to, that credible knowledge isn't solely confined to the ivory tower. And actively drawing upon credible knowledge that can be found outside of these kind of traditional academic sources and ways of knowing, and bringing them into our teaching within the classroom in a way that's meaningful, ethical, and void of this kind of sensationalization that underpins a lot of kind of approaches to issues of inequality of class. And adopting a view from within in the context of this module is about, as I've already mentioned, foregrounding the voice of working class persons in order to avoid the objectification and the fetishization of teaching class inequality and working class lives within academia. So just thinking then practically about how I achieved this view from within. So I mentioned at the start that the module was designed in co-collaboration with working class students. And that was a key kind of principle that although I identify as coming from a working class background and identify as a working class academic, I wanted to bring students into the conversation about how we craft and how we move forward with a module, particularly when it came to thinking about what topics were important to teach. There's so much to say about class inequality, and 11 weeks is by no means enough. So decisions have to be made about what to include and what to exclude. So as well as working with working class students to design and think about constructing the module, another key imperative was that the module would foreground the work of working class academics within kind of the material and the academic material that it would engage with. So it's not that the module did not engage with academic material, but it's just that when it did, it foreground and platformed the material produced by working class academics. And often these were working class feminists writing on issues of inequality and class within sociology. It also sought to extend beyond the ivory tower by considering non-academic forms of material as well. So we looked at Cash Carraway's memoir called Skint Estate, as well as Scottish rapper Loki, Darren McGarvey's Poverty Safari. These were drawn upon as key readings throughout the module. And I've already mentioned that the student co-creation was drawn upon in order to design the module. And it was really important to me that the students were paid for their intellectual labour and their time. And there was at the time a scheme at Sussex called the Sussex Connector Scheme. So I was able to apply for money that I was then able to pay the students in order to help them engage in this project with me, which I think is really important. The students that I worked with had a lot of really enriching ideas, and they really served to create a module that's exciting and accessible. And I wanted to make sure that they were remunerated for that. So I'm grateful for that opportunity, and that perhaps poses a challenge moving forward if such opportunities and resources are not available. So I mentioned about co-creation, and I just want to take a moment to define that. So co-creation is defined as the kind of act of learning and teaching that occurs when staff and students work collaboratively with one another to create components of curricular and or pedagogical approaches. And that's a definition from Beauville, who's written quite a lot on co-creation. And I just want to talk about how the voice of students co-creators were embedded into the module. So again, I've mentioned that they were central in helping me select what topics to look at. They suggested key readings, they suggested non-academic material, they pointed me to kind of contemporary rappers, artists, lyricists, etc., as well as drawing upon my own knowledge. And it's also important for me to mention that this group of 4 students from working class backgrounds were from diverse kind of age ranges, ethnicities, etc., as well as from kind of the different kind of fractions of the working classes as well. In order to think about adopting a view from within, I've mentioned that the module foregrounds the scholarship of academics who identify as coming from a working class background, and that it draws upon material from outside of academia, so looking at artists and activists. So for one example of that was we had a week on gentrification and kind of the politics of stigma and place and space, and through that we looked at Plan B's lyrics for the rap Ill Manners that talks a lot about living on a vilified kind of social housing estate, and we use that as a way in to kind of unpick and explore these working class experiences. We've also looked at kind of films such as I, Daniel Blake, and also critically interrogated media and cultural representations of working class life. So thinking about using snippets from Benefit Street, the documentary series, as a way to kind of critically reflect sociologically on this idea of worklessness and combining that with kind of sociological insight. Importantly, I wanted to create a module where, you know, it not only foregrounded working class experiences, but also drew students into the module irrespective of their class background, because a key for me in terms of adopting a view from within is fostering and engendering greater empathy and understanding across all class social groups when we think about class inequality. And students on the module were invited to draw upon their own kind of biography and classed experiences, irrespective of whether they identified as being working class or not. So in seminars, they were welcomed to, not forced, to share their own experiences of social class. And this was quite interesting. I didn't expect, I guess, so many students to reveal really sensitive aspects of themselves, aspects of their classed experiences around the working class lives, etc. So I think that really kind of alludes to the space that was created, not just through kind of the material that was being taught or how it was taught, but also the students, their fellow students in the room as well, and how well they received individuals' reflections and so on. So they were encouraged to share their own experiences of class and class inequality in seminars through private study. They were also encouraged to keep a reflexive journal as part of the module, and this reflexive journal was private for them. It wasn't going to be something that would be submitted or shared unless they wanted to share aspects of that. And they were also encouraged, or if they wanted to, draw upon their own experience through the assignment. So there was an option to bring in an auto ethnographic element to the essay as a whole. And again, just thinking about how I can kind of continue this adopting a view from within, students were, as part of the assignment, asked to deliver or construct rather a communications task. So there was various different options, but to just give you some examples, students were asked to identify a non-academic piece of material, a music video, a documentary, a soap, lyrics, a book, whatever it may be, and kind of,
can you wrap up quickly, please?
Sure. And convey what it was that non-academic material added to academic understandings, or how it challenged non-academic understandings. And I'll just talk a little bit briefly then about the benefits and challenges and really wrap that up. It was digestible and relatable. for students. These are all anecdotal. I do have a project exploring students' experiences, but the transcripts from the focus groups are currently being transcribed. So students spoke about how the module was digestible and relatable. It gave voice to students. It legitimised working class students' experiences and created a space for them where they were learning firsthand about their own experience and drawing upon that, rather than kind of this secondary learning through kind of academics looking out, for example. And it encouraged students to question dominant understandings of class inequality in a way that perhaps they hadn't been encouraged to do so before. Some of the challenges, which again, picking up on Michaela's point earlier, this idea that, you know, it's not a proper academic module, and the hierarchies of knowledge, it's less about theory and more about a feminist kind of understanding of knowledge as coming from experience. It is coming from experiences. And also the challenge of not wanting to sensationalize the issues and the material and the topics, as well as making it inclusive, not just for working class students, but of course for students that aren't from working class backgrounds as well. So I will end that there and just leave you with those references that really kind of summarise the ethos underpinning the module. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Carli. That was great. Okay, we had a lot of comments and questions in the chat. I think people really appreciated all three of those presentations. So thank you very much. I think it's probably quite important that we do finish quite promptly at 1:30 because people have probably got other things to go to, not least eating lunch. So we've got just under a quarter of an hour now for questions and comments. Julie, you had one for Gemma? Do you want us to kick us off with that? If you're still here. If not, I can ask that for you. Gemma, the question I think was about kind of resistance to working across disciplines. Did you encounter that, I suppose, either from the students themselves or from any kind of staff who felt it was important to stick to disciplinary boundaries?
Yeah, so students came on the module knowing that they were going to be working with completely different people in engineering. So the staff involved in the module were great, the students were great, but definitely there's always resistance when you'd want to do anything new, with people thinking that, you know, you're eroding the boundaries of the discipline. I've been told that one. You know, and also students wanting to do it, but also being a bit worried that they don't have anything to contribute. Them seeing engineering, you know, STEM subjects as being the proper subjects in the university, and being perhaps a bit insecure about what they can bring to the table. But throughout the process, they really see the value of sociology, criminology, and social policy, and it gives them a lot more confidence in telling people outside of the discipline about what they can do. So a little bit of resistance from some people, but from the students, no, they just go with it.
Great, thank you. And there was also a question in the chat from Emma about your assessment, Gemma. I think you've put something about that in the chat, but Emma, I don't know if you wanted to ask it or Gemma go into a bit more detail orally.
No, I think Gemma covered that for me, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Is there anything you wanted to add, Gemma, to what you put in the chat about that?
Yeah, just so it's a digital pitch that is informally marked. The students are given feedback that they then reflect upon as part of their portfolio. It's a year-long, module. So in the first semester, it's a short literature review to get them dealing with different literature, developing those critical study skills that they need for every module. And then in semester 2, digital pitch, and then a 2,000-word portfolio.
Great, thanks, Emma. And then we've got a question for Michaela from Stefanie. Do you want to ask that, Stefanie?
Okay. This was just about podcasts as opposed to more visual content. And I was wondering if students relate to having podcasts in the teaching classroom or doing podcasts differently than visual material. And I myself quite a visually biased person. I relate easier to visual cues. I'm just wondering, because I'm interested also in including more podcasts in methods teaching. I wouldn't even know how to start, but I found this really interesting. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that, Michaela.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Steffi. I do also use videos in my teaching from time to time, snippets from videos. I think that for me, there's because I obviously I produce podcasts and I listen to a lot of podcasts, there is something about training students in active listening, but also about how I realise that actually it might not be so disruptive in a classroom to hear somebody speaking. But I think that particularly the way that I've used the snippets from the podcast in the classroom, I think bringing another voice in can often help to make that kind of disruption as well, and to allow that kind of sense of active listening. And I think one of the things that was really clear to me from talking with both with Neve and with Olivia for the podcast about what they learned from listening was that actually it was a really good way of training their listening skills as well, and encouraging a different way of engaging with material, which could be true of visual as much as it could be of audio. I think some of this comes down to personal preference, doesn't it? But there are other things that podcasters are doing. So one of the most common ways in which podcasts are accessed is on YouTube, which is a bit strange because YouTube is a visual platform. And so what people then do is, instead of making a video, they might have like a slide deck that would go along and would help to illustrate some of the key points. So I could see that working really well, for example, with a methods podcast, where you didn't just want to be on camera all of the time, but you wanted to show images that illustrated a point. And you see it as well in respect to the kind of assets that people produce around podcasts. So I didn't mention any of that, but there's a whole set of social media assets that often go along with podcasts, which might be more visual. They might be videos, or they might be images of something you were talking about on the podcast. So I think there are creative ways that we could address that.
Thank you. And then there's a question for Carli from Anna, who's asked me to read it out. How were the students chosen to work with you in creating the module?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't actually go over that. It was quite a rigorous process, actually. So it was an internal scheme, external to me. So I had to apply for the money, and then there was a job advert, and students had to apply and also attend like a selection event. And I wasn't involved in that process at all, which was quite good because it gave me a bit of distance. However, the students that were selected, not necessarily by me, they were students from sociology. I had 3 out of 4 of them I had taught before, and I think that was really important in terms of creating a foundation and rapport and a relationship between me and the students. And I think that was one of the key factors attesting to how the success of kind of how confident or comfortable rather students felt in kind of saying, no, I don't think that'll work, or I think you should focus on this, and there's these issues to consider. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And Gemma, I think you had a question for Carli as well, didn't you?
Yeah, Carli, I just wanted to know, like, that was amazing, by the way. I just wanted to know if you'd had any resistance from staff to your approach, for a completely selfish reason. I wanted to ask you that question.
No, not at all. No, I've been really supported by the department and wider university. And I think what Sussex wants to try and do is, where it fits and where it would add to the experiences of students, try and foster more staff-student co-creation. But again, I'm very mindful that I wouldn't have felt comfortable taking students' time unless I was paying them for that labour. So that's really important for me. But yeah, no support, no resistance. Not that I know of anyway.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. And Carli, I think you had a question for Gemma.
Oh, now I need to think, where is this?
I think it was right at the start, but I could ask it if you prefer.
Thank you. Yeah,
I think it was about kind of, what the students got out of it, what you think the major benefits to them would be or were.
Oh yeah, that's it. Gemma, what the benefits they feel that they got out of doing that versus like a traditional dissertation?
Yeah, the skills that they gain So in addition to actually undertaking their research, having different spaces, including a research day where they have an external audience and they present their findings through a podcast, a short video, or in person, and then getting constant informal feedback from peers, both inside the discipline and outside the discipline. So that and the constant exposure to industry and embedded employability as well. And they leave the module just that they've done something completely different that goes beyond their comfort zones, and that just gives them confidence in everything that they do. And often they leave the module going on to a master's or employment in a completely different area than they'd ever expected going into. So we have quite a few students end up going into areas of environmentalism and sustainability in different industries. So that it challenges them to do something new. And also completely anecdotal, but I do want to do some research on this. Obviously, I'm very openly dyslexic, and a lot of the students that come onto my modules, but this particular module, are dyslexic. So we end up with quite a high proportion of dyslexics, and this kind of setup seems to work better for all of us.
Thank you. And I had a quick question for Michaela. I mean, your experience of teaching this way sounded really fascinating. I was just wondering whether it led you to think about using podcasts as a way of student assessments. I know in my department, we sometimes get students to make podcasts themselves as a way of, giving their experience of a variety of ways of communication too. Is that something you've experimented with at all?
I haven't experimented with it, but Ala and I have been talking about changing our module to include it as a form of assessment, but we're just going through a process of curriculum transformation. And I'm struggling to think about how I would do this in ways that align with the management terms around authentic assessment and constructive alignment. So, but no, I think it is something I would like to work with, and I know other colleagues who've done it. I think it's just thinking about the work to kind of break that down. I've seen people using it for master's students, and there are some really interesting master's course produced podcasts, particularly around law and human rights, that I think are really path-breaking in that respect. So it's on my horizon, but yeah, I think that's I do know that is a possibility. But it's also one of the things that we're facing more generally is students being overly anxious about alternative modes of assessment. And that keeps coming back at us at Lancaster. And I think that obviously anything like that would have to be thought through well. And there are models, as Gemma's just said in the chat, for how to do that. But I think it is, being cautious of our environment is one where we're having problems. Well, I won't say we're having problems. We have lots of challenges, particularly around students whose first language isn't English, that actually podcasting might produce some additional challenges around, as well as more generally that it's a technology. The production work is not something that students are so familiar with, but I'm sure there are ways that we could make it accessible. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we will have to bring this to a close now. But I think there are quite a lot of interesting resources and comments in the chat, so I haven't had time to flag up all of those, but do have a read of that if you haven't done before we finish. But just wanted to say a very brief few words. I think Carli said at the start the kind of the reasons that we thought this would be kind of an interesting thing to do. I think we both thought that teaching for many sociologists is an important part of our professional lives, and providing some kind of space for people to come together and talk about that. And also, obviously, teaching and pedagogy is really important for passing on our enthusiasm for sociology to future generations. So I think that enthusiasm has come out throughout today. So that's been great to see. And then also, as Carli mentioned, to kind of, provide perhaps a bit more space within the BSA for people to have conversations about teaching and about pedagogy. And that's something that I think both of us hope will continue in the BSA and other channels. And one of the ways in which we're hoping to facilitate that is to put together a special issue of a journal to focus on teaching sociology in higher education. Our plans for this aren't very concrete yet, but we'll certainly send all of you, those of you who presented, but also others here today, details about that when we have them. But I'd just like to end by thanking everybody. Thank you for the audience for being so constructive, having great questions, engaging so well. Thanks very much to the BSA for supporting this. And perhaps biggest thanks to our speakers today for sharing their fantastic experiences with us and to be so open in the Q&A and discussion. So thank you very much. As Carli said, we've been recording this, so it will go up as a resource on the BSA website. But thanks for participating. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good afternoon.